Good afternoon. Welcome to today's online conference entitled Executions, Means to the Mullahs' Survival. We are here with you today from the exhibition hall in Ashraf 3, an exhibit dedicated to the 120 years of struggle for freedom in Iran. Today's event is being broadcasted live via social media due to the pandemic. You can follow us live on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and it's being broadcasted live in 3 different languages: English, Farsi, and Arabic. Share the event and also your views with us using the hashtag 1988 Massacre and No Impunity for Mullahs to share the message of today's event.
In recent weeks, there's been a new wave of death sentences being handed down to Iranian protesters. So while commemorating the memory of 30,000 political prisoners massacred in the summer of 1988, we will be also addressing the role that impunity has played in the face of this regime's crime against humanity. We will be addressing the result that this international indifference has had, on the one hand for the Iranian regime, and on the other hand for the Iranian people. We will be addressing the role that executions have played in extending the mullah's lifeline for the past 4 decades.
In today's program, we have with us a panel of distinguished experts, legal experts and human rights experts, and also prominent personalities who will be addressing the conference. Also, we have with us first-hand eyewitnesses of the massacre of 1988, sole survivors of the 1988 massacre, and the families and relatives of those who were executed.
So without further ado, let's listen to our first speaker for today's lineup, David Jones, MP.
It's a huge privilege to join you in this important conference to discuss the 1988 massacre in Iran, a tragedy that Amnesty International described as an ongoing crime against humanity in its powerful and disturbing report entitled Iran, Blood-Soaked Secrets. Now, this is a matter on which I wrote to our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, earlier this month. And I said to him, the Foreign Office is aware that almost 3 decades ago, close to 30,000 political prisoners were executed extrajudicially in prisons across Iran over a few weeks in the summer. These executions were documented in detail by the former UN Special Rapporteur in Iran, the late Asma Jahangir, in her annual report to the UN General Assembly on the situation on human rights in Iran in August 2017. There's also ample evidence, independent NGO reports and testimonies from eyewitnesses and survivors, proving that these mass executions were ordered and sanctioned by the highest authority in Iran at the time. Furthermore, many current senior officials and ministers in Iran were members of the so-called death commissions responsible for carrying out and supervising the killings. And it should be noted that the Amnesty International report made special reference to the country's current chief of judiciary, Ibrahim Raisi, and the Justice Minister, Alireza Avai. Now, these facts not only lay bare the international community's inexplicable failure to uphold international law that was enacted specifically to prevent genocide and massacres, but also highlights a worrying culture of impunity for serious human rights abuses in Iran. And colleagues, there will be no end to human rights violations if perpetrators are rewarded and promoted rather than facing prosecution, as would appear to be the case in relation to the 1988 massacre. Annual resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council since at least 2011, which are fully supported by the United Kingdom, have all condemned the Iranian authorities for far less serious crimes than the 1988 massacre, which many prominent human rights lawyers and advocates consider to be one of the worst crimes in post-war history. Baroness Boothroyd, our great former Speaker of the House of Commons, has said that the 1988 massacre of political prisoners is the greatest unpunished crime against humanity since World War II. I have therefore urged our Foreign Secretary and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to take the initiative at the United Nations and work with our international allies to make sure that this year's adopted resolution on Iran includes a paragraph calling for an independent international investigation into the 1988 massacre in order to establish the true extent of the crime, as well as a call to bring to justice those found responsible through prosecution in an international court. Without accountability for serious human rights abuses, which translate into the culture of impunity that I've already mentioned, all of our efforts to protect and promote human rights in Iran will be in vain. So I believe that it's time for the United Kingdom to live up to its respected international reputation and its obligations as an important global actor for the promotion of human rights and the rule of law, by making sure that the United Nations delivers the long overdue justice that the victims of the 1988 massacre and their families deserve. Thank you for listening to me.
Our next guest in this segment of our program is Parveen Firuzan, an ex-political prisoner who served years of her life in the dungeons of the Iranian regime. Please join us in welcoming Parveen.
I was imprisoned from 1981 to 1990 in Tehran, Evin, Gohardasht, and Qizilhisar prisons. I witnessed just a small portion of the heroic and brave resistance of my sisters, which I will discuss very briefly. If I write any song of true love, it will be forever indebted to the shining sun of their love. As it is said in this poem, I will not let go of this pain. I will not break this bond as long as I live. One of my dearest friends, Ashraf Ahmadi, was arrested in 1981 and hanged in 1988. She was among the first persons to be executed during the massacre. In 1981, we were in Section 311, solitary confinements. She was in my adjacent cell with her very young son. One night, we noticed that Pasdaran, the guards, raided the cell. We recognized the voice of Lajavardi, the butcher of Evin, among them. After about 5 minutes, we heard this mother screaming. They took her child by force. The mother was screaming, "Where are you taking my son in the middle of the night?" They had no mercy. The child was also screaming and calling for his mother. 39 years has passed, but still, when I recall this scene, I feel my heart is burning. It was so intolerable to see the way in which they took the son away from his mother. Ashraf was a real hero. She had spent 3 years in the Shah's prisons. During Khomeini's reign, she resisted steadfastly from 1981 to 1988. Once Lajewardi told her, "We just want you to refer to the MEK as munafiq, hypocrites." "Why should I say so?" she asked. "Like everyone else, I know them as the Mujahideen." This was her crime. She called them Mujahideen and called them by their true identity. There were countless other mothers who were executed during the massacre. Their children were left with no parents. Mahin Qureshi, Mahnaz Yousefi, each had a daughter. Afsaneh Shir Mohammadi, an architect, had a very cute daughter who always asked during visits, "Mom, when are you coming home?" She always replied, "I will come home when the spring comes, when the flowers blossom." Well, indeed, she became a flower herself, but the mother and daughter were never able to be with each other. They executed one of our sisters, Tahmine Sotude, who was paralyzed. Another case was Tayyebe Khosro Abadi, who was handicapped. Her 2 legs were paralyzed by birth. Orders had been issued to free her, but she was executed. Afaq Daknama had severe epilepsy. They had no mercy on her either. They executed them all. During the massacre, we were in a 3-story building called school. In the first floor, there were 5 locked rooms. The prisoners could only go out of the room to wash the dishes of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So the door would only be opened 3 times a day. There was no breathing time, as they called. On the second floor, there were people who worked at workshops, and the rest were recent entries. On the third floor, there were a number of Marxists as well as 30 of our sisters. During the massacre, we were in solitary confinement, and we did not know what was happening. Later, when we returned to the locked room, from all 5 rooms, no one was left alive except for one. All were executed. From the second and the third floors as well, most of the prisoners were executed. As a result, all the prisoners of 3 floors were taken to 1 floor. In other words, about 150 of our sisters were executed. I had memories from each and every one of them. I witnessed their heroism. Each of them had stories of painful, bitter tortures, such as the cage. Some of them were in cage for 9 months. Some had spent 2 years in dungeons and solitary confinements. Those heroes stood by their promises to their people. They have indeed encrypted the word Mujahid on every brick and every stone of those buildings. They are the reason why the word Mujahid will be eternally alive in our history. Hail to all of them.
It's absolutely heart-wrenching to see and experience that firsthand, where 150 women are executed all of a sudden in one prison. The atrocities committed in the Iranian regime's prisons against women are unthinkable.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Giulio Terzi, former Foreign Minister of Italy and one of the most outspoken activists for free Iran.
Dear friends, distinguished guests, Beirut catastrophic explosion on August the 4th have been new tragic events for an entire country, Lebanon, as other countries have been devastated for the unique reason that the criminal Iranian leadership is still in power. Regional and global terrorism continue to be Mullahs' fundamental strategy. It has been spreading even further now that the theocratic regime feels weak and endangered. Terrorism and repression are financed, directed, and implemented by Iran's bloody hands. Hezbollah, IRGC, MOIS, and an enormous intelligence apparatus. Today's Iran is a huge threat for the entire world. How many nations and how many families have been devastated by Iran actions, by the #1 terrorist state in the world? How many thousands of murderous attacks the Islamic Republic and their proxies have launched against Americans, Europeans, Arabs, Asians, Latin American citizens all over the world? 20th century's genocides in Europe, Africa, Asia began and developed always, mainly because of cowardice, dreams of appeasement, fears, and lack of political will on the side of governments and public opinions. The same governments and public opinions did have all the means to prevent, in those occasions, to prevent such obscenities. They did nothing. And in the best of cases, they did too little, too late. We all know what did happen in Iran in that summer of 1988, following a decree issued by Ayatollah Khomeini. Political prisoners were executed en masse in a matter of a few months. The international community in its entirety did know at that time and still knows very well nowadays. The United Nations, the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council, they all are knowing and did know for many years. There is no doubt that 1988 killings were crimes against humanity, the clear beginning of a vast political and ethnic genocide, that it is still the real work in progress for the Iranian theocracy, a work in progress against all opposition groups, religious and national minorities, which are dissenting from the regime. Many of the perpetrators of the Iranian regime's perpetrators currently still hold key positions. For example, the head of the Iranian judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi, and the Minister of Justice, Alireza Awai, have been members of the death commissions. Mustafa Pur Mohammadi was also a member of the death commission and now is a close advisor to the so-called moderate president, Hassan Rouhani. Many personalities and organizations, like the Organization in Search of Justice, individual governments, have appealed to the United Nations in order to establish an international independent commission of inquiry. They have called to the United Nations to conduct independent investigations, to provide accountability and justice for the victims of these horrendous violations of human rights. The Iranian genocidal regime must be stopped and must be brought to justice. His long arm, Hezbollah, must be included in its entirety in the list of terrorist entities sanctioned by the European Union, the United Nations, and other regional or global organizations. And the same should happen for the IRGC and MOIS. The imminent session of the United Nations General Assembly is the first and most urgent opportunity for our agenda aimed at the establishment and promotion of the rule of law and justice in Iran. Freedom and democracy, dear friends, will be very soon a reality there in your country. It will be very soon a reality because a widely popular political and moral force has further grown and strengthened even during the present crisis. And it has done so under the strong and impressive leader of the Iranian resistance, the leadership of Madame Mariam Rajavi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Terzi. We will now go to Belgium to hear from a mother. We have with us Razieh Parandak, a mother who had to go through the torment of having her son under torture for years and then executed.
My name is Razieh Parandak. I recall you the story of Mehran. In 1982, Mehran participated in a demonstration in the city of Karaj. He was arrested. For 3 or 4 weeks, we were referring to any place we could think of, searching for him. They said they didn't know where he was. We were finally able to trace him in Jahanbani prison for a 5-minute visit. 2 weeks later, they took him to a revolutionary court of Karaj, where he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. But they held him for 6 years. First in Ghazal Hisar and then Gohardash prison. Let me share a memory with you. We went to visit Mehran in Gohardash prison. It was around Nowruz, New Iranian Year. Mitra was 3 or 4 years old. Children under 7 or 8 were allowed to go to the other side, but we had to stay behind the glasses. Mitra went to the other side. Mehran kissed her. When she came back, Mehran gave him a beautiful flower made of napkins. It was a pink rose, very well made. He asked Mitra to bring the rose to us as a gift. But a pastor, whose name was Khani, and I will never forget his name, took the flower from Mitra and tore it apart from our eyes. Mitra came back crying. In 1987, he was released. After 1 or 2 weeks, he said that he would leave the country. He should leave, and that he had not been freed to build his personal life. He spoke to me about his plan to leave the country and join the members of the organization in Iraq. I accepted to help him. We thought he had successfully crossed the border. He had given us a code and had told us to listen to Radio Mujahid, which will broadcast that code so we would know that he had reached the destination. We listened and listened, and there was no code. We were frustrated. One day, 2 motorcycle riders came to his father's newspaper stand and told him not to look for Mehran, and that Mehran was in Gohardash prison. They had arrested him when he was crossing the border. After that, I used to go every other week to ask what was happening. They didn't allow shorter intervals than 15 days. They said he had not yet been tried, and they would inform us once he was tried. I went there time after time for 1 whole year. Then I asked his father to go. I thought maybe they are not giving me a straight answer because I was a woman, and a woman didn't have any value to them. Next time, his son went there, and he was told, yes, we executed him. His father demanded documents and asked for what reason he had been executed. One of them told to the other pastor to go and fetch his watch to convince us of his execution. The father asked them, where is he buried? The pastor told him, deposit 100,000 toman to Imam Khomeini account and we will tell you where is he buried. 3 days later, they called us and said, come and get his belongings. His father went there. They gave him a bag with a torn shirt, the towel, toothbrush, and toothpaste that I have given him, with a piece of stone, which I think he used for his prayers, as well as a short plastic rope of about 60 centimeters. I never found out what that was supposed to mean. As the mother of one of the victims of the 1988 massacre, I call on the UN to form an independent fact-finding mission to study the 1988 massacre, to put an end to their immunity, and to end the cycle of execution in Iran.
درود بر شما راضیه خانم و خیلی ممنون که این وقت رو در اختیار ما گذاشتید و در برنامه امروز ما شرکت کردید.
Now I'd like to ask Baroness Verma of the British House of Lords to address our conference.
Today's conference on the 1988 massacre in Iran comes at a very timely moment because usually it is in this month of August that Canada, UK, and the EU begin to draft the UN resolution on the human rights situation in Iran, which is then voted on at the General Assembly later on in the year. This has been an annual tradition at the UN General Assembly for at least a decade, when the international community condemns the regime's egregious human rights violations and abuses in the country. This annual UN resolution shows that everyone agrees that the human rights situation in Iran is appalling and must change for the better. But if we consider the developments in Iran since the beginning of 2019, the human rights situation is deteriorating as the regime resorts to cracking down on popular dissent, popular protest to silence the ever-growing dissent in the country. There have been reports of at least 1,500 protesters that have been killed. Thousands have been arrested during the 2019 November protests. And we have had the shooting down of a Ukrainian flight over Tehran in January 2020, which sparked more popular protests. And in recent months, there are reports of death sentences and executions of individuals who took part in the protests in recent years. Western democracies can no longer ignore this clear connection between the regime's leadership and the involvement in serious human rights violations, like the 1988 massacre, which was described by Amnesty International as an ongoing crime against humanity and the worst crime in the history of the Islamic Republic. Otherwise, we will never see nor expect to see any other improvements or changes for the better. It is paramount that in the upcoming UN resolution, the General Assembly adopt a resolution to address the issues of impunity and accountability, especially in regards to the 1988 massacre. That all countries support the resolution to ensure an independent international investigation into the 1988 massacre and establish a clear accountability process in an international tribunal to prosecute those that are responsible. This should replace the article in the UN resolution adopted last year that asked the regime's judiciary to carry out this investigation, which unfortunately held no confidence because of those that were expected to lead the investigation. The UK government remains steadfast in its condemnation of the regime's human rights violations in the past year. This lends hope and encouragement to an independent investigation taking place. I know that such a measure has strong cross-party support in both houses of the UK Parliament, as well as in the Canadian House of Commons that has already declared the 1988 massacre as a crime against humanity. Parliamentarians across the globe have been united in speaking out against the inhuman atrocities, and the governments are uniting in voice to condemn and ensure accountability of actions by the regime. Madam Rajavi, we stand by you and all of those that are fighting for a free, safe Iran.
Thank you, Baroness Verma. And now for our next speaker, we have Parveen Purighbali, an ex-political prisoner who suffered many years in the prisons and dungeons of the Iranian regime. She's an eyewitness to the 1988 massacre.
Greetings to all of you, all my compatriots and everyone hearing my voice and watching this conference. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell you about my fellow inmates and briefly talk about my observations. The fact is that my words cannot convey enough for anyone to realize what has happened in those years. Events that, despite the passage of more than 32 years, cannot possibly be forgotten and continue to have their influence. I was in prison from 1981 to 82 and then again from 1986 to 91. On both cases, I was arrested on charges of being a supporter of Mujahideen. First time I was a 15-year-old girl, high school student. There were other 13 or 14-year-old kids in the prison, all the way up to older mothers. I witnessed the killings of 1981 as well as the massacre of 1988. I'm basically a survivor. I saw the creation of a generation of women in resistance. They started with expression of discontent because of the regime's limiting of freedoms. They were protesting, they were supporters of the Mujahideen. Many were arrested at very young ages. In many cases, two sisters of the same family were there. One was tortured and executed, and the other sister was witness to that. These are the kinds of things I witnessed in 81 and 82. But when I was re-arrested in 1986, I was in fact faced with another generation, something totally different. When they were taking me to the cell, I heard a lot of noise. I tried to look from beneath the blindfold what was happening. There was a sister, her name was Elahe Daknama, who was later martyred in the massacre. They were dragging her on the floor, beating her. They wanted to transfer her to another section against her will, and she simply wouldn't submit. The regime didn't know what to do with this resistance. That was basically the decision made for the massacre. The decision was made long time before it was enacted. In July of 1988, they came to our section asking questions, and I noticed that the resident inspector in the prison was putting marks aside the names of some. We couldn't imagine what was going to happen. It was so unimaginable to execute so many people in a 1 month period. Even now, it's difficult to imagine. all these prisoners were already sentenced.
همه این بچه‌ها حکم ابلاغ شده داشتن.
Many of them should have been freed. Farhana Zarfchi was a student who had been arrested. She was 15 or 16 years old at the time of arrest.
15-16 ساله بود که دستگیر شده بود.
They pressed her to take part in a TV interview, denounce the Mujahideen, and say, I support Khomeini. And of course, obviously, she wouldn't do that. Then they put pressure on her family. Hossein Zadeh, the director of the prison, pressed the family to convince or actually force her to write a document and repent from her briefs. She did not submit. They executed her during the massacre. Mojgan Surbi had served her sentence. She should have been freed, but they executed her. These clothes belong to a friend of mine called Mahbube Hajali. We were arrested together. She was a few years older than me. She taught many things in prison to me. It was a while since I last was in prison. I didn't know many things, and she explained things one by one. She told me about the history of things, and she told me about the tortures committed against prisoners. On August 4, 1988, I was taken out of their section to go to court. I had a few pictures from my sister, who was in the National Liberation Army at that time. I had a few other things. I left them with her. She said, they don't have anything against you. Why are they taking you? I didn't want to tell her that this is a picture of my sister. I just asked her to keep them for me. When I came back, Mahbube was not there. She was executed. She never came back. These are her clothes. She always used to wear them in the section. This is where she put her pen. I am proud of her. All through these years, she has been my heritage of resistance. Many nights I have vowed to her that no matter how difficult the circumstances, I will continue in her path. Not just Mahbube, but many others as well. We were good friends. We were very close. I never believed that they had executed to that extent. Azadeh Tabib was another case. She was extremely smart. Her father was a doctor. There were 3 sisters who had all been arrested, not at the same time though. For Azadeh, that was the second time in prison. She used to teach classes. Since we had free time, she would teach mathematics, and I liked very much to go and learn from her. Azadeh was beaten very badly. On her second time, since she had done some acts to expose the executions and inform people about the Mujahideen, they beat her very brutally. Her feet had been deformed and they were extra flesh. She coughed very much. She was in bad health. Azadeh was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment. Her sentence was done. When we came back to section after the massacre, it was September of '88. After a while, the visits were back on track again. Azadeh's family, soon after it was allowed to visit, came to see their daughters. When they came, Azadeh's sister went to see the family. When she came back, she said that Azadeh's belongings was given to them, and that was when I realized that all my fellow inmates were executed. Everyone was gone. Before that, although there was no one left in the prison, in the section, we always thought they might have been transferred. We looked for some signs of them. Maybe they are being hidden from us. We continued to look for them. But when Azade's sister went to visit the family and came back, that was when I realized that everyone was executed.
That's a truly devastating scene. Imagine going back to the ward and seeing that nobody's there from the inmates that have been imprisoned with you for years. Now we have with us the next generation, born after the massacre. We have with us Behruz Maqsoodi, son of political prisoners whose uncles were executed in the 1988 massacre.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be part of today's conference with such moving testimonial. My name is Behruz Maqsoodi. I'm 28 years old and I live in Norway. We have been hearing the stories of each family and the eyewitnesses today. And even for me, despite being raised with this reality, I'm still in awe of what really happened in the summer of 1988 and throughout these years in Iran. Today, I would like to share the story of my family with you. In a family of 7 children, 6, including my mother, were jailed for supporting PMOI. 3 of my uncles were executed between the years 1981 and 1988. Saeed Atarzadeh Olia was 19 years old and arrested by the IRGC in 1981. His crime was supporting MEC. 2-3 days before execution, he called home to say that he was in the notorious Evin prison in Tehran. He was executed 18 days after his arrest without any court or conviction. In the early years after revolution, the name of those executed were published in the national newspaper. My family found Saeed's name in the newspaper alongside the name of 90 other prisoners that were executed. The regime even censored Saeed's testament and gave it to our family. My uncle Saeed was a true hero, and the regime couldn't even tolerate his last words. This is the picture of my uncle Saeed, executed in 1981. Behruz Atarzadeh Olia was my youngest uncle. He was arrested in June 1981 when he was 16 years old. Many youth, including Behruz, were fed up with the situation and turned to the MEC as the alternative, which represented the desire for freedom and democracy. We don't know exactly where and how Behruz was arrested, but the regime was really brutal and wanted to take revenge when they captured MEC supporters. Even though Behruz was a minor at the time of his arrest, the regime kept him in the Evin and Ghazalesar prison for 7 years without a sentence and finally executed him in the 1988 massacre. And today I carry his name. My grandparents visited their children in the prison every month, but in the summer of 1988 the regime cut off all visitation and said that they have to come back the next month. However, after Behruz was executed, the regime sent an agent to my grandfather's store and gave Behruz's belongings in a bag to him and said, "We have executed your son for supporting infidels," also MEC. Until this date, we don't know how he was executed and where he was buried. This is the picture of Behruz Atarzadeh Olia. My third uncle, Mohsen Attarzadeh was arrested in 1985. Mohsen owned a small technical business in the city of Mashhad. He was very popular in the area. He once called a friend who lived in Paris who was a supporter of Mek. Since all phone lines were tapped, Mohsen was arrested on charges of attempt to connect to the opposition group. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Most describe him as a man of principles, who had a sense of humor even under the difficult conditions in the prison. According to his fellow inmates, he was always firm on his beliefs and protested the inhuman conditions in the prison, which also came at the price of more torture and solitary confinement. My father, Abul Hassan Maksudi, who was also political prisoner for 8 years, spent some time in the prison with Mohsen and always talks about his bravery. Once, when my great-grandmother asked him to give up the struggle, he replied that he can't put struggle against the dictatorship on hold until further notice. Iran will be free. He was 24 years old when he was arrested and executed 3 years later in the summer of 1988. Even though he was given a 10-year sentence, we still don't know how he was executed and where his grave is. Every summer revives the memory of fallen heroes for freedom, and I'm very proud of my uncles who chose to stand up against the Mullah regime despite its heavy price. The massacre of 1988 remains to be one of the darkest chapters of modern history post-World War II, and is still one of the least exposed and discussed. The Iranian regime continued to deny the 1988 mass elimination of political prisoners. None of the perpetrators or masterminds have been brought to justice, and none of the regime's senior officials, including the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, have been held accountable. The Mullah regime's current head of judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi, was a member of the death committee. Raisi, who has boasted of his role in the massacres, is busy these days, issuing execution sentences for protesters. This is the direct result of the impunity. We, the families of the 1988 victims, demand an independent investigation by the UN into one of the most hideous crimes against humanity after the Second World War. Thank you for your time and giving me the chance to share our history.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, one of the most prominent figures advocating for human rights globally, a man who needs no introduction, Professor Jean Ziegler. He previously served as the Vice President of the Advisory Committee serving the UN Human Rights Council.
In 1988, a horrific massacre took place in Iran. More than 30,000 young people generally linked to the democratic movement of the People's Mujahideen, were murdered in prisons, in the streets, in their homes by the IRGC, the killers of the Mullahs regime. It was not a case of police brutality. It was a mass murder ordered by the head of the regime, by Khomeini, by a fatwa from Khomeini. A cold-blooded massacre that has gone unpunished to this day. The killings continued even after the massacre of the 30,000 who were martyred in 1988. For example, my friend Kazem Rajavi, the delegate of Mujahideen to the United Nations International Human Rights Commission in Geneva, an academic of very high value, of international reputation, Kazem Rajavi, brother of Masoud, was assassinated in 1990 on April 24 near his home in Tannay in the province of Vaud in Switzerland. And many more martyrs fell under the bullets of the killers. I say it and I will say it again. Scandalous impunity to this day. The heirs of these 1988 martyrs rose up in 2018 in magnificent mass demonstrations where with their bare hands they faced the IRGC to demand freedom, demand sovereignty, self-determination, democracy for Iran. The regime also carried out a terrible repression. More than 1,500 absolutely peaceful, absolutely non-violent protesters were murdered. Since then, in prisons, they continue. These criminal mullahs continue to hang young demonstrators who have committed no other crime than to demand freedom of speech, democratic freedom to demonstrate. But there are other heirs of the martyrs of 1988. They are the residents of Ashraf 3, these heroes, men, women, adolescents, who are gathered today in Albania and who keep alive the memory of 1988. They keep alive the democratic aspirations of the Mujahideen, the People's Mujahideen. Maryam Rajavi, Masoud, and my friend Kazem, who was assassinated, embody for the Iranian people and for the world this demand for democratic, peaceful, secular, tolerant Iran, peacefully inserted in the community of nations. There's no doubt that the regime, the Mullahs regime, the appalling regime, will fall sooner or later. And I think very soon, very soon. The crimes have gone unpunished to this day, but the legacy of the martyrs, the fire of peaceful combat, the patience, the determination of the Mujahideen under the leadership of Maryam Rajavi, every day unmasks more, pushes back further the arbitrariness of the murderous dictatorship of the mullahs. The United Nations will soon draft and pass a resolution on Iran. In this resolution, it is absolutely necessary that the massacre of 1988 not only be mentioned, but that we demand the creation of a commission of inquiry. Commission of inquiry as the United Nations created for the genocide in Rwanda or the Srebrenica genocide. The third genocide of the end of the last century, the genocide of young Iranians and young Iranians in Khomeini's prisons in 1988, requires the establishment of a commission of inquiry. impunity is intolerable. The grief of families is deep. The mourning cannot come to an end without this commission of inquiry, without transparency. The mullahs often, and I should add, Khomeini created not only a fatwa but a death commission to oversee the 1988 massacre. This death commission is made up of people, many of whom are in power to this date. For example, the Minister of Justice, the head of the courts of Rouhani's government are former members of the death commission. All these assassins, all these terrible criminals have committed crimes against humanity that has no statute of limitations. The United Nations, the member states of the UN that will draft and adopt this resolution on Iran must demand the establishment of a commission of inquiry. And this commission would not only clarify for eternity the responsibilities of the massacre of 1988, but the commission and the evidence that it will uncover will perhaps deal the fatal and final blow. And I hope so. For the bottom of my heart, to the appalling, dictatorial, arbitrary, murderous regime of the mullahs. I end by saying that personally I'm full of gratitude, full of admiration for the struggle of the people's mujahideen. They saved the honor of humanity by their sacrifice, by their struggle, by their determination. Deeply grateful that there is a movement like the Mujahideen, which fights for the freedom of the Iranian people, but also for our freedom, for the dignity of the Iranian people, but also for the dignity of all free men and women. Thank you deeply. Deep admiration for the people's Mujahideen, heirs to the heroes murdered in 1988.
Thank you, Professor Ziegler.
Now we have with us Zainab Shadbash, whose family is another victim of the 1988 massacre.
I am Zainab Shadbash. I'm very happy that in this conference I'm able to tell you about what the regime did during the massacre of 1988. My aunt Maryam Tawanayan Fard is one of the martyrs of this massacre. She was 25 years old when she was arrested for installing posters and got sentenced to 7 years in prison. They took her to Evin and was awfully tortured. After 7 years, they told us that she will be freed. We went with flowers and sweets to receive her, along with my grandpa and grandma. But they threw her back to us and said, "We have executed her." When I see the picture of Mustafa Salehi, who has been recently executed, and think of his 2 children, I very much remember my own memories of that time. I was 7 years old, and my most beautiful moments were the mornings when we were going to visit my aunt in Evin prison, where we had to wait for long times in long lines of families to finally go inside the prison. I had always seen my aunt from behind the glasses. I loved her so much, and to the last moment of the visit, I would wave at her so many times. At the end of the visit, I would place my hand on her through the glasses, and I would say goodbye to her. In one of the final days, they told us that we can have a person-to-person visitation. I was fortunate to visit her in person, along with my cousin. I was very little back then, so my mom filled my pockets with fruit and said, "You are going to see your aunt, Mariam. Remember to give her our warmest greetings." I and my first cousin went inside. I was very scared of the huge physics of the guards. Once in, I faced many of the women, and among them I suddenly saw one running toward me. My heart had stopped because it was the first time. It was the first time that I was able to hug my aunt in person. I jumped in her arms. Up in the air, we were being exchanged between other women. They were all so alive and so happy. So, those were the most beautiful moments of my life. And then I recall my mom had filled my pocket with fruits. I attempted to pull them out, insisting Mariam to take them. But she put the fruit back in my hand and told me, "These are yours. But remember not to forget us once you get out." I did not understand what she was talking about, although I felt this is maybe my last visit. My first and last visit. I said, "Don't worry, you will be freed soon. The family look forward to see you out there." She hugged me tight and said, "Shall you not forget us?" I would never forget those moments. And one of my motives for stepping on this path is she herself. And of course, there are many like Mariam who sacrificed their lives for this cause. Surely those memories helped me in choosing the path and joining Mujahideen. Once I joined Mujahideen, I looked for her cellmates to see if I could find someone to tell me about her. Fortunately, I found a few of her mates which had survived. It's hard for me to talk about it. These were difficult moments, hearing the memories of her. They had tortured her so severely. The skin of her soul had gone completely. And in order to continue the torture, they had to cut some skin off from other part of her body and stick it to her souls. Truly, the crimes of this regime have no limits, and one could not believe them. The tougher part was when I learned that the night before her execution, they cut her left foot and her right hand to punish her, and then they would go ahead with the hanging. I couldn't imagine what our prisoners went through in the prisons. And the most painful is that this is going on still in Iran. Many are waiting their execution under this regime, and so many children will not have their wish of seeing their fathers and mothers and aunts and uncles granted. Therefore, I would like to ask the United Nations and Amnesty International and a serious request to pass a resolution on this matter. It is the wish of all those whom their voice cannot reach you, and I am one of them. Thank you.
the barbaric methods used by this regime, like amputation of arms and limbs before execution, just go to show the true inhumane nature of this regime.
Exactly.
This is something that has been practiced in Iran for over 40 years, and also in the 1988 massacre. At times, entire families were wiped out, and it's been reported sometimes that 5, 6, or even 7 members of one family were executed within a few days or a few weeks. One of those families is the Shojai family.
12 members of this family were killed in the 1980s by the Iranian regime, 5 of them in the 1988 massacre alone. We have with us today Yahya Shojai, or Pedar Shojai. His daughter and nephew, 19 years old, his son-in-law, and 2 other nephews were executed in the 1988 massacre.
Hello, Pedar Shojai. Thank you for participating in this event and accepting our invitation. 12 members of your family were executed by this regime. How many were killed during the massacre?
4 members of my family, they were executed in 1988. They were in prison, they were released, and then they were rearrested and executed.
Would you please tell more about your daughter Nasrin? When Nasrin was arrested, and what was her charge?
I don't remember the exact date, but we had told Nasrin not to get involved in politics. But through one member of a distant family member, they found out and they came and arrested her, and she was eventually executed.
Is that true that when Revolutionary Guard attacked your house in order to arrest you, when they found out that you're not in the house, they took Nasrin as a hostage because of being sympathizer of Mujahideen?
She hadn't done anything. Nothing. Just because she was my child. Our family was following the political situation. We were supporters of the People's Mujahideen organization of Iran.
How long Nasrin was in prison?
Nearly for 2 years. She was released, and then in 1988 she was arrested. She was in prison for about a week, and then she was released to get treatments. And about after 2 days, she was rearrested and she was executed.
In closing, I want to ask you, what is your request as a father of a martyr of the massacre and somebody whose family were executed during this massacre from the international community?
Well, the international community, as we know, they want to know the truth. And they should do investigation about these executions and why these people were executed. Without doing anything wrong, they were executed. They were in prison, then they had been interrogated, and they hadn't found anything wrong against them. but they were released and then they were rearrested and imprisoned, executed.
Once again, thank you, Pedar Shojai, for give us a chance for participating in this event. Of course, we know fathers like you have a lot to say about this massacre. We always welcome any chance that we hear from you. Thank you.
It's heartbreaking to hear from parents who've had to endure this pain for decades.
I remember there was a civil hearing in February 2018 held in Geneva where Pedar Shojai actually testified. And when they would ask him about the tortures his daughter had endured, even after 30 years, it was difficult for him to be able to utter the words that my teenage daughter was raped, tortured, and executed by the regime.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I and many of the most prominent Albanian artists have been with the Iranian resistance and the Ashrafis for many years, and we consider ourselves partners in their struggle against the oppressive regime that rules Iran. We know that the clerical regime has committed many crimes against the Iranian people, especially the Mujahideen, and the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in 1967 is one of the greatest of these crimes. We have met and talked with the witness of the regime's crimes in Ashraf III. Today, in the 21st century, the horrible crimes of this regime against the Iranian people continue. They killed 1,500 protesters in the streets in November 2019, executed some protesters in prisons, and sentenced some oppressing prisoners to death. As a representative of the Albanian art community, I call on the international community to refer the case of the regime crimes, especially the massacre of 1967, to the Security Council, and to mourn the perpetrators of these crimes, many of whom are still in the higher position of the regime. Our wish and desire is that the Iranian people be free from the clutches of this dictatorship and be able to flourish all their talents in a free country. Thank you.
will now go to Maryland, where we are joined by Mr. Torshizi, a senior RF engineer who 3 of his brothers were executed in the 1980s in the massacre of 1988. The floor is yours, Mr. Torshizi.
Thank you so very much for taking the time and listening to my testimony about my brothers. I'm the only surviving sons of my mother and father, Aqdas and Ali Torshizi. 3 of my brothers, Behruz, Bahman, and Reza Torshizi, have been killed by the regime. Behruz Torshizi, my younger brother, was born in Tehran on March 20, 1962, on the eve of Persian New Year, and that was the reason we called him Behruz. A good day. He was such a smart kid, and at the age of 5, he went to elementary school. And by the time that he was 15, he got his diploma from high school. And he was accepted to one of the hardest university in Tehran, Science and Technology University, in the field of mechanical engineering. After the revolution, Behruz joined Muslim Student Association, which is connected to Mujahideen Khalq or MEK organization. On Tuesday, 24th of September, 1981, Behruz leaves home, and that was the last time we saw him. We did not know what happened to Behruz. We were looking everywhere. We contacted the authorities and asked them for Behruz's whereabouts, and they said that we have no idea. And those days, everybody was telling us something. Somebody told me maybe he was in an accident. Go and look all the hospitals. We went to hospitals after hospital and asked if they have somebody by the name of Behruz Torshizi. Nothing. And somebody told us that there are several committees, jails here or there, and go and ask those places. So we went to all police stations, committee, Pastaran, whatever that we could think of. We asked for Behruz, and they said that no, we do not have anybody by the name of Behruz Torshizi. And it took us about 17 days, every day, from early in the morning until late at night, we were looking. Until one day in daily newspaper, Kayhan, we saw that there was a article that 73 people, they have been executed. And we took the paper and looking for the names to see. And to our surprise, we saw Behruz's name in the newspaper on row 48, Behruz Torshizi, son of Ali. He was executed. I'm sorry. My father goes crazy. The following day, he goes to, there is a place in Farsi, we call it Sazeman Bazrasi Kol. They look after all organizations, you know. It's like inspection general. And there was an Ayatollah there called Mustafa Muhaqqaq Damad. And my father asked the following question: who arrested my son? We searched everywhere. We could not find a trace of him. Where was the trial taking place? Was there an attorney present? Why there was no appeal? Why you did not inform us to be present? Why you did not give us the body for burial? All sorts of questions. And finally, what was the crime of Behruz? And Ayatollah Muhakkik Damad says to my dad, carrying a camera and taking pictures of demonstration. And it was like pouring an ice bucket on my dad. And he said, you killed my son for carrying a camera and taking pictures. He was the most talented person. He was mechanical engineer. And you just killed him for taking pictures. As of today, we have no knowledge of what was the court proceeding, who was the judge, who was the prosecutor, and for sure there were no attorney. And what was the crime? Taking pictures. After that, my other brother, Bahman Khurshidi, disappeared on January 1982. He was my older brother, born on February 16, 1954. He went to Science and Technology University, and his field of study was industrial engineering. After the revolution, he also joined Muslim Student Association and connected to MEK. So my other brother, Reza Khurshidi, he came to my mother and says, let's go and look for a place to hide because I don't know what's going on. Bahman has disappeared and I fear for my life. So my mom and Reza, they went out to find an apartment for temporary location. And it was in January 1982. And Reza and my mother disappeared. Reza was born on Thursday, October 13, 1955. And when he went out with my mother, they disappeared. Now we don't know what happened to Bahman, what happened to Reza, and what happened to my mom. And after 1 month, my mom came home and she said that Reza and I, we were arrested for people who are familiar with the Tehran, in Gisha district. And they took us to Evin prison. And in Evin prison, they told me that my other son, Bahman, has been killed resisting arrest. So from that day, we know that Reza is in Evin prison, and my mom was told that Bahman is killed, and they have buried him without our knowledge in Behesht Zahra Cemetery, section 92, row 123, number 15, on his exact birthday, February 16, 1982, at the age of 28. So my father and my mom go to Evin prison and ask to see Reza. And the guard look at the list and they say, sorry, we do not have Reza Khurshidi. Come next day, maybe his name pops up. So my mom and dad go next day, nothing. Next day, nothing. Next day, nothing. It took them 4.5 months to finally get to see Reza. They were being tortured outside prison for 4.5 months because they knew Reza is in prison and their guard refused to let them visit him. After finally visiting Reza, Reza told them that they have sentenced him 7 years in prison. Reza's sentence was basically done. So my dad, he goes to Mr. Muhakkik Damad and asks him, and Mr. Muhakkik Damad says, Reza's release is at his own hand. He needs to repent to get out. My father told him that his sentence is over. He said, it doesn't matter, he needs to repent. So he goes to Reza and asks him, why don't you repent and come out? And Reza says, Dad, it's not that easy. They have divided the prisoner in 2 camps. One group they repent, one group they don't repent. And they expect people who repent to kill, execute the other one that do not repent. And I cannot do that. My dad goes back to Ayatollah again and says, please release him. His sentence has been over. And Mr. Ayatollah tells my dad, let me see what I can do. I will call you. And a few days later, somebody calls my dad and says, come to Evin prison. My poor dad thinks that Reza has been released. But to his surprise, they gave him a bag and they told him that these are Reza's belongings. And my dad could not believe it and says, you killed my son after finishing his sentence. I don't know. Reza was buried again in Behesh Zahra. They gave us he was executed August 24th, 1988 on the 11th day of Muslim holy month of Muharram, which according to the Ayatollahs, they should not kill anybody in this month. And they buried him at the age of 33 in Behesh Zahra, section 98, row 149, number 17. This is the story of my life. Sorry. Other than Behruz's name, Reza and Bahman have never been acknowledged publicly by the regime. Thank you very much for the time. And let me show you the pictures. This is the picture of Behruz. This is the picture of Bahman. And finally,
و این هم عکس رضاست که در جریان قتل عام 67 کشته شد.
I'm happy to be able to speak today at the request of the Women's Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. This is a serious matter and one that needs to be dealt with and ultimately answered by the Iranian regime's authorities currently in power. There should be support by all the international commissions and the United Nations. So many people, so many young people, women, so many young men were executed, murdered. 30,000 people were murdered in 1988. And there was total silence. Total silence while families need to know. They need to be able to get their bodies back. The dead need to be buried and honored. Otherwise, the families will come to haunt the Iranian authorities for the rest of their lives. They will haunt the people who did not hesitate to murder political prisoners under the worst conditions against humanity. These are crimes against humanity. It is not conceivable to ignore them in silence. We, all the women, support the Iranian women who want to know about their sisters, their mothers, their grandmothers. It is unacceptable for such a massacre to be ignored. I had the good fortune to meet all these women who fight every day with the framework of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. I admire their courage, I admire their perseverance. My support for them goes back to 2016, and since then, every year, they have been raising their voice for justice. I raise my voice along with them now. It is not possible. It is not possible that in the 21st century such a crime goes unpunished. All of you, United Nations, United Nations and my dear representatives, do not let that go. It's not because it is just Iran that has issues of human rights, rights of women, rights of men, and that the human rights are violated. We will all continue to cry out for justice, for the bodies to be given back to the families, and finally, at the end, the light will come out and shine. Thank you.
And now we go to Norway, where we're joined by one of the daughters of the victims of the 1988 massacre, a dear friend, Amina Qarai.
Hello to all of you. Thank you very much for the honor to be with you in this conference. I am the daughter of Mehdi Qarai, one of the martyrs of the 1988 massacre. I was only one when my parents were arrested for supporting the MEK, and I was in prison with my mother for several months. Since the terrible conditions of prison had extreme effects on me, due to my mother's insistence, I was given to my father's family outside prison. After that, I could only see my parents just once a week for a few minutes, to the point where I could barely recognize them. Eventually, after 2.5 years, my mother, and after 4.5 years, my father were released. And at 5, for the first time, I could experience being with my parents. In June of 1986, only 10 days after the birth of my only brother, my father was arrested for making a simple telephone call to a supporter of Mujahideen abroad. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and once again we had to meet our father from behind the glasses of the prison. After 2 years, in the summer of 1988, as a constant Wednesday tradition, we went to visit. But in one of those visit times, they informed us that all political prisoners were banned from any visits, and we cannot see them. We required them to give us some reason. They didn't. After that, we gathered behind the closed gates of the prison several times a week, so maybe they permit us to see our dear ones. After 3 months, the agents of the regime contacted my grandfather, telling him, "We have executed your son." My grandfather asked them for the address where he was buried. There was no answer. Further, they threatened him that he was not allowed for any ceremonies whatsoever, and that this matter must remain hushed, and we should keep quiet about that. Afterwards, we and other families tried their best to look for signs of their graves. In a big ceremony in our city, there was a place, and rumors said that there was a mass grave there. A grave digger from the area had told a relative of ours that he had witnessed with his own eyes that overnight a government truck had carried the corpse of the prisoners wearing prison uniforms, and they had buried the corpse, the bodies, in a mass grave, and then covered it using a bulldozer. From then on, Mashhad's Behesht Reza was actually our rendezvous place, and a lot of families would go there. Their parents planted flowers and trees, but regime's mercenaries didn't even allow that. They even feared a flower growing from the graves of our unknown martyrs. The next week we would return and see that they had burned the flowers, uprooted the seedlings. They constantly threatened us that we had no right to gather there. The case of 1988 massacre is such an extensive case, a huge tragedy, that it's really unbelievable. And today, after 32 years, we're still waiting for results. We're waiting for prosecution of perpetrators and agents of this crime. In reality, had it not been for the Mujahideen and the round-the-clock efforts, and especially dear Sister Maryam Rajavi, maybe the massacre of 1988 would be forever forgotten. Since Mujahideen's struggle is not just for spite and hatred towards Khomeini and his criminal mercenaries, but it is for the faith in emancipation, for the love of liberty and love of their people and freedom. So our campaign is not just reflecting a hatred or anything of the kind of revenge for the regime's criminals, but it is to put an end to imprisonment, to torture, to execution, to massacre. As a child of one of these martyrs, and on behalf of families of victims of 1988 massacre, whose number is thousands and thousands, and the many kids in Iran who are waiting, who are seeking answers, waiting for some sign, some address of where their parents have been buried. I have friends who have lost both their parents, and their voice isn't reaching anywhere in Iran. On behalf of all of those, I demand the United Nations to form an independent committee to investigate the massacre and, in fact, to help stop the circle of execution in Iran. The world must not keep silent against all these crimes. We are all of one body and are responsible for anything that happens anywhere in this planet. I hope, along with all you dear ones, very soon we'll celebrate the freedom of our nation in a free Iran and build a prosperous and free country. Thank you all.
امینه جان خیلی ممنون از اینکه این فرصت رو به ما دادی و در این کنفرانس شرکت کردی. البته در همه صحنه‌ها همیشه حضور داری و درود به تو که هیچ وقت نذاشتی پرچم پدرت به زمین بیفته.
32 years and her grandmother is still waiting for her son to come home.
The torment that these families have been put through, some of them are still in a state of limbo, not knowing about the fate of their children. And could you just imagine a 7-year-old girl having to imagine the different methods of execution that may have been carried out on her father, but still trying to keep hope that maybe this is all just a bad dream?
من در زمان قتل عام سال 67 توی زندان سمنان بودم.
At the days of 1988 massacre in Iran, I was imprisoned in the prison of Semnam. I was a youth, less than 20 years old at the time. The regime and its executioners did their utmost to leave the massacre in the dark. Even for myself, being inside the prison, the story was obscure. My fellows were taken away one after another for execution, but I couldn't imagine such horrible occurrence. Nowadays, while memorizing those days and putting together the puzzle, I realized that the regime carried out its plot very mysteriously and calculated. Prior to the massacre of summer 1988, the regime made interrogations in fall 1987. The nature of those interrogations wasn't clear to us, but afterward, gradually, I figured out the purpose was to sort the prisoners based on their political position. Short after the massacre began in June 1988, I was brought to solitary confinement. One day, one of my fellows was returned from the court. He was put in the cell next to me. His name was Mohammad Reza Ahmadi. He told me with remorse about his experience in the court. He couldn't predict what was about to happen, but he felt that the procedure of the court was somehow unusual. I asked him about his prediction. He answered firmly, "Such procedure is not initiated to offer us freedom, but rather to lead us to gallows." I asked him, "Are you ready for this?" He answered, "I have been ready for years." Days after, another prisoner, a female prisoner named Aghdaseh Hemmati, said similar words to me. Due to savage torture, she had become paralyzed. She said that she was put in the cell and we could communicate with Morse. She spoke about the interrogators. She said that such action during interrogations is not a good sign. It signifies likely execution. I asked her, what does she think? She answered, "I have prepared myself for such case." Another fellow of mine, Gholam Reza Delavari, was an academic and well-educated person. Through the years in prison, he had gathered a bundle of his own handwritings. One day, he gave them to me, asking me to keep them in a safe place. And in case I was about to be transferred, I should burn them. I'm trying to point out that each of us inside the prison, at the threshold of the massacre, we were in prepared circumstances and ready to be executed. However, none of us could imagine that such vicious massacre is about to happen. When I entered in solitary confinement, all the cells and partitions were full. There were 2 partitions, actually 2 long easels, all filled with chock-full solitary confinement. On December 1989, when I was transferred to Evin prison, from Evin prison to Semnan, all the cells were empty, meaning, except me and 2 other persons, all of those prisoners had been executed. This aside, I'd like to tell another fact. I'd like to talk about the kids who were being executed. One was named Ahmad Safari, a teacher who had a little kid of 4 years old at the time. Ahmad truly had no guilt. He was just a teacher who also was a supporter of the MEK. They took him to execution. When I got out of prison after 13 years, I saw the effects of those crimes on the families out there. For example, I mentioned Mohammad Reza Ahmadi, which we had spoken after returning from the court. He told me that his mother, 2 years after the execution, every Tuesday would travel 100 kilometers from Garmsar to Semnan for visitation, meaning she had never believed the execution of his son, since they gave her no gravestone, no corpse, and no information indicating the execution of her son. Another example, Miss Aqdas Hemmati, in her own house, she had proceeded with the mourning ceremony for her daughter and her executed sons and daughter-in-law. Later on, they abducted her and she disappeared ever since. I myself witnessed, for instance, one friend who was executed in 1988. He had 3 kids, 2 daughters and 1 son. His kids were little. After 20 years, when I had come out of prison and met with them, they still did not know whether their father has been actually executed or no, because they were shown neither a grave nor a news on him. It seemed as if they were still awaiting the return of their father. This is just a painful actuality, that the massacre of the prisoners is more of a continuous crime which still goes on, than just a massacre for eradication of the prisoners, meaning the families of the survivors of the massacre are still experiencing it, because there are no evidence or documents to show whether their kids have been executed, under what circumstances they might have been executed, and whether there are any remainings.
The first-hand testimonies that are being given today really need to be heard by the international community. That's why I would like to ask once more from all our viewers today to share today's events on social media with your foreign minister and the UN representative of your country in New York.
Time for holding Iran regime officials accountable. Summer 1988. Then, Supreme Leader Khomeini issued a fatwa calling for the execution of any Mujahideen prisoner still faithful to the organisation. In a spate of several months, 30,000 political prisoners were executed. The Death Commission asked young men and women a simple question: do they renounce the MEK? Those who refused to do so were executed. Amnesty International has called this massacre a crime against humanity and demanded that the perpetrators be held accountable. 32 years since that heinous crime, the perpetrators continue to be amongst the highest-ranking regime officials. The current judiciary chief, Ibrahim Raisi, was a member of the Death Commission. The international community must hold the clerical regime and the perpetrators of this crime against humanity accountable.
It's my honor to be able to present our next speaker, Kirsty Bremlou QC, a prominent international and human rights barrister and the first female to serve as the chair of the bar for the Human Rights Committee in England and Wales.
In 1988, a crime against humanity was committed by the Iranian state. Around 30,000 people were executed in a few months. What happened was that in July 1988, Iran's supreme leader, Khomeini, issued a fatwa ordering the execution of political prisoners, members, sympathizers of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. And in fact, there were two waves to these killings. The political prisoners were executed first, and then there was a social cleansing of the agnostics, the atheists, the apostates, and also those seen as undesirables. Khomeini set up, they were called amnesty commissions, in more than 70 provinces and towns in Iran. They became known as death commissions for obvious reasons. This information has all been verified as evidence has been gathered over the years since these atrocities occurred. What happens is that people were rounded up, including those who had actually served prison sentences and had been released, and also they included those who were actually serving sentences where they had been given by a court. And they were put before the Death Commission. The Death Commission was not in any way a judicial commission or any sort of tribunal which was compliant with fair trial standards. A series of questions were asked, and if the person was not considered to demonstrate sufficient loyalty to Khomeini, he or she was executed by hanging or by a firing squad. Some of the questions included whether he or she was willing to clear minefields for the Army of the Islamic Republic, and hesitation was sufficient for execution. Dignity was not even afforded in death. In February 2018, I acted as counsel to a People's Tribunal in Geneva, and there I heard the accounts given by many family members and survivors from this time. Accounts given included that from a father who described that he received the news of the execution of his daughter by being told that the bullets required payment, the bullets that had been used to shoot and kill his daughter. Others gave accounts and evidence of their desperation to find information about the whereabouts of their loved ones in order to bury them with dignity and in accordance with their religious traditions. Their bodies are still unidentified and not located in many cases, dumped in mass graves. One elderly woman I heard from moved me greatly as she spoke of still believing that her son must still be alive somewhere in a prison in Iran, as she had never recovered his remains. An audio tape emerged on the 9th of August 2016 from the 15th of August 1988. And the audio tape evidenced discussions by Khomeini and others, whereby it was made clear by him that pregnant women and girls should be killed. There was to be no exception and no mercy. Moving to the present and what lawyers and activists are campaigning for. There is little progress in addressing this crime against humanity. The late Ashma Jahangir, in August 2017, in her capacity as Special Rapporteur, reported on the mass executions in Iran in 1988 in her report to the UN General Assembly. And it needs to be put firmly back within the orbit of the United Nations. This massacre needs to remain at the forefront of the United Nations considerations when it considers human rights violations in Iran. One reason for this, aside from the international law framework, which also governs Iran, is that if it is not tackled, impunity from 1988 continues to impact and inform human rights violations in the present in Iran. So the international community must do much more. It must explore concrete pathways to truth and justice with a view to ensuring that those suspected of responsibility are prosecuted in fair trials without imposition of the death penalty, and with a view to providing families of victims with reparations in accordance with international standards. Those responsible or suspected of being responsible are not difficult to locate. Many are speaking about their role there and in fact boasting of their role there in 1988 in recent interviews. For example, Mustafa Mohammadi, forgive me for his name pronunciation, gave an interview on the 25th of July 2019 where he attempted to justify the killings. Montazeri said, as was revealed in the audio recording, the following: "In my view, the biggest crime in the Islamic Republic for which history will condemn us has been committed at your hands, and they'll write your names as criminals in the history." The message could not be clearer that a tribunal is required to examine the evidence of what happened in 1988 to provide remedies and reparations with a view to informing and preventing human rights violations in the present and in the future. The families of those who have been killed, disappeared, deserve no less. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. At this point, we're delighted to be joined by a dear friend, Hengame Haj Hassan, a former political prisoner and author of the book Face to Face with the Beast, or Cheshm dar Cheshme Hayula, which is a memoir of her years in prison. This book has been published in 6 languages: English, French, Italian, Swedish, Arabic, and of course Farsi, and is available online on Amazon.
Hengame, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Thank you. Could you please tell us what were you arrested, how many years spent in prison, and what was your accusation? I was a nurse in Sina Hospital. I got arrested in 1981 on charges of supporting the Mujahideen. They took me to Evin prison, section 209. I was there for 3 months, then another few months in section 246 in Evin. Then I was transferred to Qezel Hisar prison, where I served another 2 years, so the total of 3 years in prison. You wrote in your book about your experience in cage. Probably many of our audience might not be familiar with terms like cage, residential units, and things of that sort. Could you tell us about these means of torture that the regime utilized, and particularly about the cage and residential unit? First, I'd like to say that the regime's ways of torture were not limited to cage and residential unit. These were just 2 of them, specifically designed to be implemented on female prisoners. Because the first crime in their eyes would be being a woman. The regime did not want to see a woman standing up to it, let alone resisting. As soon as I got arrested, there was only torture, nothing else. lashing under the foot, hanging with different styles by feet, by hands, by one hand. I mean, the most brutal and severe methods of torture. It's inconceivable that a human could do such tortures to another. But this regime did all of them. Particularly since we were nurses, I mean, when we got arrested, aside from being a supporter of the Mujahideen, one of our sins was attending to the wounded. 5 of my classmates were executed, 4 of them in 1981, the 5th person, Shekar, after 7 years of torture in residential units, cage, 350, solitary confinement, Gohardasht, closed cells, which I will explain later. Eventually, after 7 years of torture, she was finally executed in 1988 massacre as one of the first groups who were executed. The reason was particularly her resistance against these torturers. She did not want to question her identity as a mujahid. And this was just bitter for the regime. All of the prisoners were like this. Khomeini executed all of them for this very reason. I remember many of them, Mujgan Sorbi, many underage kids, 14 or 15 years old, who turned 18 in prison. They executed all of them. To tell you about cage and residential unit, it was in Ghazal Hezar prison, since the resistance by women had actually become very hard to swallow for the regime. Haj Davoud Rahmani, the deputy of Lajavardi in Ghazal Hezar, made a few cages. They made series of cages. We named them cage. There were also devices called coffins. And also the residential units, which was called by them as dog houses, because it had terrible living conditions, no light, no sanitary. They would toss the food at the prisoner as if they are feeding an animal. As for the cage, they took for delusive reasons. For example, we made tea, and they punished us. Although I had seen all sorts of tortures by the regime, this one I couldn't believe. I couldn't believe that they have made such a place. This is the schematic of it. It used to be a sporting area in Ghazal Hezar like this, and they put these boards approximately 2 feet from each other against the walls like ping pong tables, or just normal way. Then they made us sit there wearing our chador, blindfolded, without making the slightest move or the slightest noise. We didn't have the right to cough. Even if our spoon hit the plate, they would consider it Morse coding with other prisoners next door, and they would torture us. They would take us outside for harsh beatings. There were always a few guards, postars, standing quietly right behind us, and suddenly would beat us. For example, once they kicked me, throwing me against that wall. And this was the softest way of communication they had with us, let alone those unspeakable punishments. I was in a cage for more than 7 months. Not just me, many of others as well. Once I could count around 90 of these cages in that space. So only in this one, there were 90 prisoners. Whilst they made more cages in Unit 3 as well as Unit 1 of Ghazal Hezar. And then, aside from the female prisoners, they brought in men, tortured them severely. For instance, once I heard a scream from a brother. I don't know what they did to him, but it was a scream that for a long time I could not sleep remembering that scream. It was so terrible. And after the scream, He shortly shouted and then became mute. I don't know what they did to him. Later on, when they found out that the women, the Mujahid women, were stronger than these tortures, that resulted in some conflicts within the regime. For example, Khomeini's heir apparent Montazeri opposed that. Some of the families went to Montazeri complaining that they don't know about their loved ones. The executioners tried to hide the location and the situation of the prisoners from their families. We were kept in horrible conditions. The families were seeking for us everywhere, in hospitals, in morgues. For example, my friend Shekar, there are 3 nurses, my fellows. They were executed in 1981 except for Shekar Mohammadzadeh, who was put in cage and also residential units. And this is Tahmine, who was also executed in 1981. All of them were executed on charges of being the Mujahideen and taking care of their wounded. Shekar told me about the horrible tortures in the residential unit. She said, when we came back to the appalling cages, it was like we got some rest. That was the extent of tortures carried out in the residential unit. When Shekar was telling me about this, she was shivering. She couldn't talk, and I stopped her because I didn't want her to be under that kind of pressure. In the residential units, they were kept standing for long days. Shekar told me that she was forced she was kept in standing position for 6 days. And this is how much she could count, and then she fainted and went unconscious. Cruel and bestial tortures by pastors, inhuman people. In the residential units, all 24 hours they were watching over the prisoners. They said, we are Muslim women and you are men. And imagine, not ordinary usual men, but vicious interrogators and pastors standing above you, depriving you of any privacy. They said we didn't even dare to go to bathroom or take a shower, or because they were always watching on us. Shekar said they instructed us to imitate the voices of animals, and then they would ride us like riding a horse and told us to walk in that situation. They wanted to crush the personality of the prisoner. If I were to tell you about the tortures, it will take forever, many years. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to hear part of the crimes of the regime. In hopes of putting an end to the immunity of the regime and putting an end to the regime itself.
"32 years ago this month, a crime against humanity began in Iran, in a tempest of savagery that has not been surpassed since the end of the Second World War. The fascist theocracy began the systematic execution of political prisoners. Within months, they had hanged over 30,000 men and women, mostly members and supporters of the People's Mujahideen of Iran, the PMI-MEK, the main democratic opposition to the Mullahs. They were murdered on the orders of the psychotic supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a man who claimed to be the voice of God on earth, but was in fact the disciple of Satan. Khomeini instructed that the execution should be carried out in haste and that even pregnant women should not be spared. The show trials lasted for no more than 3 minutes and consisted of the prisoners being asked the question, do you support the PMI MEK? If they answered yes, they were marched out to the prison courtyard and hanged in batches of 6. Young men and women who had been released from prison after serving sentences for supporting the PMI MEK were dragged back before the summary courts, sentenced to death and hanged. The bodies of the 30,000 murdered martyrs were buried in secret graves. Their families were forbidden from speaking about their deaths. Monstrous acts of butchery like this have become grisly milestones in the history of oppression and tyranny in contemporary Iran. And even the death of Khomeini brought no respite. His successor, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has presided over a regime that now executes more people per capita than any other country in the world. Iran has become, in the words of US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the godfather of terror, an international sponsor of terrorism. They brutally shot down and killed over 1,500 young protesters who took to the streets of Iran's towns and cities in a nationwide uprising last November. Deploying their Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, the regime's Gestapo, the mullahs have unleashed a homicidal blitz on their own population, crushing dissent, wantonly murdering and maiming thousands. For decades of rampant corruption, medieval brutality, unchecked abuse of human rights and women's rights, together with the country's emergence as an international pariah, this has left 80 million Iranians angry, frustrated, and demanding regime change. Yet the mullahs live a life of luxury and spend billions of euros supporting Bashar al-Assad's brutal civil war in Syria and on funding Hezbollah and other terrorist groups like the vicious Shia militias in Iraq and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Many of the key executioners during the 1988 massacre now hold senior positions in the fascist dictatorship. Why, after 32 years, has no one been held to account for this horror? The 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran is an example of both a crime against humanity and a genocide. Based on international conventions, neither crimes against humanity nor genocide are allowed to expire with the passage of time. At a time when the Iranian people have shown with their consecutive and nationwide protests that they are sick of the current regime and the ongoing violation of human rights, it's surely the duty of the international community and especially the United Nations to respond by supporting their call for justice. With the UN General Assembly due to take place in September, the Iranian people are now watching closely. They are appalled that the UN has removed the 1988 massacre from their agenda. This item must be discussed. Failure to do so would represent the UN condoning murder. It is the duty of the UN to examine this case and bring its masterminds and perpetrators to justice. The time has come to pull down the curtain on this murderous regime. The mullahs must be held to account in the international criminal courts. After 41 years of tyranny, the Iranian regime's time is up. The mullahs and their supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, must now face justice. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Hossein Farsi, a former political prisoner and eyewitness to the 1988 massacre.
I am Hossein Farsi. I was imprisoned for 12 years. I was arrested on charges of supporting the Mujahideen. In 1988, during the massacre, I was in Gohardasht prison. Before we knew anything about what was going on, family visits were cancelled. From July 19, going outdoors was disallowed. The newspapers discontinued. Then there was limited visits. And then the events of the death committee occurred, and we faced the death committee. In Tehran, the death committee, as referred to in Khomeini's decree, was comprised of Hossein Ali Nayeri, Morteza Eshraqi, and Mustafa Pur Mohammadi as the representative of the Ministry of Intelligence, and Ibrahim Raisi, whose name was not mentioned in the decree, but acted as a member of death committee all through the days of massacre. He signed many of the execution sentences. Presently, Hossein Ali Nayeri is the regime's Supreme Court judge, and Ibrahim Raisi is the head of judiciary. Mustafa Pur Mohammadi has been a minister in the regime twice and is now one of Raisi's deputies in judiciary. These high positions are indeed their award for the crime in 1988. It was done in this way. They took out literally hundreds of the prisoners and had them sit in long corridors. Then the prisoners, one by one, would face the death committee. Each prisoner would go face the death committee. There were a few simple questions about their personal information, and then the key question was this: what are you charged with? If you said the word Mujahid, that was it. The death sentence would be signed. Then they would take the prisoner to another corridor in Gohardasht prison. The prisoners would be seated at a distance of about 1 or 1.5 meters from one another. When the death sentences piled up, the warden of the prison, who was simultaneously acting as the prosecutor, Mohammad Mughisi, who is presently a judge in regime's judiciary, he would either himself or his deputy would come and call our names. His deputy was a hangman called Hamid Nouri, the same person who is now in custody in Sweden. They would call the names from the death sentences. Anyone whose name was called would stand up and come to the middle of the corridor, blindfolded. They would put their hands on the shoulder of the prisoner in front of them. Long queues were formed. I personally witnessed the formation of these queues many times. Each queue was formed of 50 to 60 or even 100 prisoners. And then they would march towards the killing field at the furthest end of Gohardasht prison. In Evin prison, the process was similar. Some of the demonstrations you see in the Resistance Museum, it portrays the reality there. It was exactly like this. Long queues, hands on other prisoners' shoulders, and marching towards the execution site. From what I heard from others, when I used to go to the death committee to face them, and a few days that I spent in death corridor, I can tell you that it was essentially the supporters of Mujahideen who were put before the death committee. When they left the courtroom to sit in the death corridor, there was a very different environment. They used to talk and laugh, especially after it was revealed that they were going to be executed. Strange, unbelievable, and moving scenes, and in my view, very historic. A stunning example was Hossein Nia Khan. He was seated in front of me. We were blindfolded. He sang the freedom anthem. He repeated the lyrics. Freedom, oh freedom, shine your light to our graves after we are gone. My own brother was executed in Evin prison. He was 18 years old at the time of his arrest in 1981. He was executed at the age of 25 during the massacre in Evin prison. What I want to mention is the extent of pain and suffering of our families through these years. Behind the prison doors, they were being bounced back and forth. They were insulted, humiliated, and mistreated by pastors. This still goes on. Many of the families still don't know where their loved ones are buried. Many are arrested for attending at the graves of their loved ones. They're not even allowed to mourn for them. Many still don't know or have recently found out what has happened to their relatives. There's one example, a moving example. We were recently contacted by an Iranian youth who had just found out that his father was martyred during the massacre. He said he didn't have any information in that regard and asked us to tell him what we knew of his father. The suffering is still going on. Presently, my brother is in Evin prison. My sister is in Qarchak Varamin prison. My sister has cancer and heart disease. She has had a surgery for her cancer, and now they have taken to Qarchak Varamin, where is known for the spread of COVID-19. There's no guarantee that she would not be infected. So her life is at risk. The family is worried. Her children, parents, they're all worried. My brother Ahmad in Evin prison's section 8. In that section, there are 12 known cases of COVID-19. There are no guarantees that the rest would not be infected. There's no care. My brother-in-law, Manucher Bulurian, is in the same section 8 of Evin prison. This is not a new situation. It is a 40-year-old story, the story of family.
Now we will go to the Netherlands to hear from Dr. Farah Eslami.
Hello everyone, my name is Farah Eslami and I'm proud to be part of today's conference on the 1988 massacre. I'm living in the Netherlands since I was 1 year old, and in the Netherlands I studied both law and dentistry, and nowadays I'm working as a dentist. I was born after the 1988 massacre, but I have a direct connection to this crime against humanity. My aunt, the little sister of my father, Farah Eslami, is one of the 30,000 victims of the massacre, and I carry her name. Farah was a student activist, and she was arrested and imprisoned for 3 years. When she was released, she had been subject to such horrific torture that when taken to a doctor, the specialist was shocked and came to tears when they found out they were due to torture, because they had never seen such wounds. In early 1988, Farah was rearrested, but it wasn't clear why, and they never gave her a sentence. During a prison transfer on July 20th in 1988, their vehicle broke down, but authorities decided to spend the night in a nearby village. And with the break of dawn, they took Farah amongst 4 other women, Hakime Rizvandi, Nasrin Rajabi, Yasume Haydari, Marzieh Rahmati, with 2 men to the nearby hills in Salah Abad, where they had them executed after they had them raped. Then they were buried in a ditch, one on top of the other. On November 26th of that year, my grandfather received a call to go to the prosecutor's office, where they gave him a bag with my aunt's belongings, and they told him that they had executed Farah for supporting the Mujahideen. They were giving the address of the grave under one condition: only 1 car could go with 4 people. It was grave number 6, a ditch about 10 meters long, where they had piled the bodies. The foot of one was on top of the head of the other. 4 months had passed since the execution, and therefore it was hard to identify the bodies, but the families managed to do so. My aunt Farah was identified by her hair because she had curly hair just like mine. She was only 25 years old when she was executed, and I'm older than she was, but yet we have yet to see justice served. My aunt was one of more than 30,000 young and brave children of this proud nation, and just one of those who stood up against this theocratic Islamic mafia, which has done everything that God has forbidden in the name of Islam. My aunt had committed no crime other than saying no to the crimes committed in the name of Islam and saying no to this fastest way of thinking. Today, my request from the international community is to put an end to this impunity. This cycle of death and execution is continuing today in Iran, an ongoing crime against humanity. My aunt Farah and 30,000 others couldn't be saved, but I urge you to act to save another generation of Farahs. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah, for joining our conference today, and thank you for continuing to be the voice of your aunt and carrying her torch.
And as you said, it's on us to prevent another generation of Farahs to have the same fate. Evin Prison, the prison that has come to be known as one of the most notorious in Iran. We have a statement, an audio message from a group of political prisoners that we will listen to now.
تابستان تبدار 67 30,000 از بهترین فرزندان این خاک و بوم از همین زندانها گذر کردند و در بزرگترین جنایت علیه بشریت بعد از جنگ جهانی دوم به دست خاک زمان اعدام شدند. خمینی فتوا داده بود هر مجاهدی که سر موضع هست باید اعدام شود. در پاسخ به رئیس قضاییه خودش که پرسیده بود آیا این دستور شامل کسانی که قبلا محاکمه شده و دوران محکومیتشان را می‌گذرانند می‌شود یا نه، پاسخ داد هر کس بر سر نفاق هست در هر مرحله‌ای که هست باید اعدام شود. در این اساس بود که در عرض چند ماه یک نسل‌کشی و حمام خون به راه انداختند. ولی این جنایت هنوز ادامه دارد. آری جهان خبردار نشد که در آن تابستان خونین چه گذشت. قتل عام 67 مساق جنایت علیه بشریت است، ولی با گذشت 32 سال هنوز پاسخی به هزاران سوال خانواده قربانیان داده نشده. آخر به کدامین گناه اعدام شدند؟ جامعه بین‌المللی در مماشات با مبتلایان در مقابل این بی‌عدالتی سکوت پیشه کرده، سکوتی کر کننده که آثار آن را هر لحظه در مقابل رویمان می‌بینیم. مسئولیت، چراغ سبزی برای ملایان جهانی در اعدام و شکنجه و زندان. آری قربانیان قتل 67 30,000 زندانی سیاسی اعدام شده در آن تابستان نیستند. این خط مبتدی است که تا به امروز و اعدام مصطفی صالحی ادامه دارد. تمام زندان برقرار شده. زندانی باشد. امروز ما در کنارمان شماری از زندانیان قیام را داریم که محکوم به اعدام هستند و جنایت علیه بشریت ادامه دارد. ما جمعی از زندانیان سیاسی محبوس در بیدادگاه اوین از دولت کانادا، گزارشگر ویژه آقای جاوید رحمان، اتحادیه اروپا و آمریکا می‌خواهیم که بر ضرورت شکل‌گیری یک هیئت تحقیق مستقل برای بررسی جامع قتل عام 67 و ابعاد آن تاکید کرده و خواهان تشکیل آن در قطعنامه بررسی وضعیت حقوق بشر در ایران در اجلاس آتی مجمع عمومی سازمان ملل شوند. چنین اقدامی گام اول در توقف اعدام در ایران و قرار گرفتن عاملان آن جنایت علیه بشریت در مقابل عدالت است.
Now we have with us as our next speaker Mr. Tahir Boumedra, former chief of the Human Rights Office of UNAMI and chair of JVMI.
JVMI was launched in September 2016, seeking justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre in Iran. Its board includes prominent personalities such as Lord Alton of Liverpool, Sir Geoffrey Bindman, QC, William Bourdon, Professor Bill Bowring, Christy Brimley QC, Malcolm Fowler, Dr. Juan Garce, and Rama Yad.
On 24th of May, 1989, the United Nations Economic and Social Council adopted a resolution 1989/65 recommending the principles on the effective prevention and investigation of extra-legal, arbitrary, and summary executions. Principle 9 of these principles reads, there shall be thorough, prompt, and impartial investigation of all suspect cases of extra, arbitrary, and summary executions, including cases where complaints by relatives or other reliable reports suggest unnatural death. This resolution coincidentally came a year after the 1988 massacre in Iranian prisons, when gross and reliably attested violations of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran were brought to the attention of the Special Representative of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights by families of the victims and NGOs. The United Nations Special Representative, Professor Rinaldo Galindo Paul, whose mandates covered the period extending from 1986 to 1996, reported that extra-legal, summary or arbitrary executions of thousands of political prisoners held in jail across Iran had taken place before, during, and after the 1988, the summer of 1988. All the persons appearing before the special representatives alleged that they had been arrested without any warrant, mostly by groups of revolutionary guards who had detained them in their homes or on the street. In some cases, Persons were arrested while accompanied by family members, including babies or children. Most of the persons described the conditions of their arrest as brutal, accompanied by beating and other forms of ill treatment. In most of the cases, no explanation was given to the detainee as to the reason for her detention. In other cases, explanations were given in a vague way. Some of the persons spent months or sometimes years in prison without any formal accusations being brought against them. Allegations were also made of long periods of incommunicado detention and of denial of family visits. The report underlined that in the course of the informal hearings, the special representative reached the moral conviction that the persons appearing before him referred to facts that certainly happened to them, and that their declarations were not the product of feverish imagination or of mere fabrication guided by political or religious motivation. Most of the executed were reported to be members of the People's Mujahideen organization in the implementation of the cleansing policy. The mass killing have been carried out on the basis of a fatwa by the regime's then Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, stating, "In the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful, it is declared that those who are in prison throughout the country, who remain steadfast in their support of the munafiqeen, are considered to be muharib, waging war on God, and are condemned to execution." When asked who could be executed and who should be spared, Khomeini wrote to his son, "Don't waste time, kill them all." Some members of the Death Committee are currently occupying important positions in the hierarchy of the Iranian administration of justice. On August the 9th, 2016, an audio recording was made public for the first time of the then Khomeini's designated successor, Grand Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri. In his recorded statement, a few days after the execution started, Montazeri is heard qualifying them as the most heinous crimes committed in the Islamic Republic of Iran. In the same medium, the alleged perpetrators are heard acknowledging their role in that mass killing in implementation of orders coming from high above. It is further revealed in the audio tape that officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran, including Khomeini's son, have been pursuing the plan to execute all prisoners, particularly those affiliated with the PMI. Evidence, including information provided by the survivors, indicate that the preparation for the massacre started in the prisons simultaneously with the acceptance of the ceasefire in the war with Iraq. Following the revelations of the Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, Iranian officials started acknowledging in the 1988 massacre. In the absence of any official independent inquiry to the mass extralegal killings and the inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment of prisoners, and given that the Iranian government had proved to be unwilling to cooperate with the UN special procedures on this matter, Justice for 1988 massacre of the political prisoners in Iran, in short JVMI, association based in London, had probed into a large amount of data emanating from various sources, including statements of officials of the Iranian government, and published 2 reports on the 1988 massacre, shedding light on what happened and identifying the suspect perpetrators. The 2 JVMI reports of 2016 and 2017 were published and submitted to the United Nations competent organs, calling for the establishment of a UN Commission of Inquiry to investigate the alleged massacre. It should be underlined that the persecution of political prisoners in Iran on the ground of their political, religious, and ethnic belongings is an ongoing crime that must stop, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. Today, in the absence of accountability, the Iranian regime is getting emboldened by persecuting peaceful demonstrators who request that the public funds be spent on the well-being of the people of Iran, rather than on exporting the Islamic revolution. Political executions, including juvenile, continues to date in Iran. Iran has the highest rate of executions per capita in the world. It continues to be among the very few countries that still use public hanging. So after all that, and after 32 years since the 1988 massacre of political prisoners, it is clear that the Iranian officials are unwilling to act on the calls of the UN to investigate and reveal the truth. It is also clear that the United Nations human rights agencies are unable or unwilling to set up an independent commission of inquiry without the consent of the Iranian authorities. The UN agencies prefer to use the soft policy and leave the door ajar for public or possible dialogue with the Iranian authorities. So what are, in the circumstances, the other avenues left to the families of the victims? In this context, I suggest 3 possible avenues. The first avenue is to be considered. The first avenue to be considered is that of the universal jurisdiction. As most Iranian suspects in the commission of crimes against humanity are already listed for terrorist offenses and for crimes under international law by the EU member states, the United States of America, Canada, and other countries. It is therefore possible for a national court of these states to accept jurisdiction over an act categorized as a crime against humanity. Although political considerations are generally taken into account in accepting or rejecting such a jurisdiction, it is possible. It is the responsibility and the raison d'etre of the human rights defenders to insist and to facilitate prosecutions and make them happen by searching, documenting the evidence and placing it at the disposal of the jurisdiction willing to prosecute. The second avenue is for the human rights defenders to facilitate the conditions for the chief prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to initiate his own initiative, after seeking permission of the concerned chamber of the ICC to undertake a preliminary investigation of the most serious crimes. The third avenue is that of referral. The referral of the case by the United Nations Security Council to the ICC to investigate and prosecute. The referral solution is subject to the acquiescence of all permanent members of the Security Council. A veto of a permanent member will stop such a referral and will prevent the involvement of the ICC. However, the acquiescence of the permanent members of Security Council is not always impossible. The referral of General Hassan al-Bashir of Sudan was initiated by a group of NGOs and was not vetoed, thanks to the hard work of the perseverance of the human rights defenders. Thank you for your attention and for listening to me.
Thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Boumedjah.
Now I'd like to introduce Fereshteh Behzad, whose brother was executed in the 1988 massacre.
My brother Mustafa Behzad was one of the victims of the 1988 massacre. In 1986, when he was only 19, he was in fact taken hostage only because my elder brother had left Iran to join the MEK. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, and despite having served his term, he was executed in 1988. I have a small memory of our last meeting in the prison. We were allowed one prison visit annually. At the end of our last visit in the spring of 1988, he told me from behind the glass cabin, very cheerfully, "I will come very soon, and we will leave together." This was our last meeting, which I will never forget. I will never forget his smile and sensation. Many things have remained untold about the massacre. I want to mention an aspect about which there has been less discussion, and that is the psychological torture and pressure on the families during the massacre. In November of 1988, they called my father and asked him to go to the committee. Since my brother had served his term, we thought it had to be about his release. My father went there happily to receive the news of his son's freedom. But upon entry, they threw a bag towards him and said, "These are your son's belongings. We killed him." In the shock of the news, my father had a heart attack, paralyzing half of his body. He also lost his eyesight. In that very condition, they handed him a piece of paper to sign. My father told them, "I cannot see anything. What do you want me to sign?" They said, he should sign a commitment not to tell anybody about his son being killed, and that we were not allowed to mourn or wear black. We never found out how he was martyred. They told us that he had had a special execution. Some say he was put in a room with a number of other prisoners and killed by a gas. Some say he was hanged. The reason we cannot know for sure is that they never delivered the body to us, nor did they tell us where he was buried. We have even no information about the way he was killed. Indeed, this is not an issue of the past. When I hear the news of the execution of the participants in recent uprisings in Iran, I recall those memories and remember the moment in 1988 when they executed the prisoners one by one and delivered the news without even returning their bodies.
فرشته جان خیلی ممنون و چه خاطره زیبایی از آخرین دیدارت با برادرت برامون تعریف کردی.
Imagine going to pick up your son and then being handed his bag of belongings and finding out that he's been executed.
There seem to be so many cases where the person had finished their sentence, but not only were they not freed and released, but they were executed.
In my view, it has become very clear that based on the information acquired in recent years, and the wave-like circulation of the information, it is now well understood that what has been going on in Syrian and Iranian regimes' prisons, tens of thousands have been killed because of their political opposition. Torture in prisons is unimaginable. Now, thanks to the well-documented testimonies, the world knows about them. These two governments are still living outside our era. The two regimes have left the orbit of human civilization due to their violent behavior. They have replaced patriotism and loyalty to human values with loyalty to the dictator and a set of false claims. They steal the slogans and contradict them in their actions. The world conscience, and especially the freedom-loving people of the world, are profoundly distressed by the ongoing events. Freedom to the two nations of Syria and Iran. Our hope is that the two nations are freed from the clutches of the ruling henchmen in the two regimes. Pride belongs to the martyrs who sacrificed their lives so that we can enjoy a future without fear.
كالبحر يجيئون يأتون موجا كالبحر يجيئون يأتون موجا يدقون أبواب ذاكرتي كالبحر يجيئون يأتون موجا يدقون أبواب ذاكرتي كل ليل كل ليل كل ليل يجيئون سرا.
And now we are joined by Reza Shemirani, ex-political prisoner and eyewitness to the 1988 massacre. Author of the book, The Honorable, or On Ajmandan, a memoir and a report of the 1988 massacre in Evin prison.
My name is Reza Shemirani, and I am one of the supporters of the MEK. I joined MEK in 1979, and I was arrested in 1981 and subsequently sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in a 2-minute-long trial without having a lawyer. I was released in 1988 after serving my term. Nevertheless, I had to go to the Ministry of Intelligence for years and sign their papers, which indicated that I was still in Iran. The point is that Lajevardi, the chief of the prison, used to say since 1981 that if I find the opportunity, I will throw a grenade in each room and kill all of you. In 1982, he told the same thing when he had come to the Ward 4 of Rezed Hisar prison where I was imprisoned. There was a lot of indications during 1987 which showed that the regime was planning a massacre and the prisoners had concluded this. Back then, there are not even a word of the operation of the NLA, such as Furugh. I will give you some example which I was witness of. In summer 1984, I was taken under interrogation because of the prisoners had organized themselves. The Branch 13 was a combination of the prosecution and the Ministry of Intelligence. Before torturing me, the interrogator intended to allure me to get information. So he told me, "We have plans for the prison. If you cooperate with me, I will help you survive the plan." Masoud Moghbeli, one of the supporters of the MEK, was taken to Tawhid prison at the same time. They had given him Radio Mujahid and told him, "Listen to it and tell about it to your friends, because you are not going to live much longer anyway." At the same time, one of the members of the Tudeh party was told in Tawhid prison that we have classified the prisoners into 3 categories: red, yellow, and white. The red ones will be killed. The yellow ones will come to our side, or we will kill them, and they will become white. And the white ones, we will release them. In the winter of 1988, there was a raid at 11 o'clock p.m. on Ward 125, where I used to be kept before interrogation. They had taken some of the prisoners, including Qasem and Mohammad Reza Karim, to the Ward 209. They were under interrogations for 3 days, and they were full of threats that you will not live for much longer. But in September 1988, and after the massacre, they called me, and a person who called himself Zamani, he was one of the main perpetrators of the massacre, called me at 8 o'clock p.m. and asked me, "Do you know why I have called you?" I said, "No." He said, "I want to give you a message. Go back to Ward and deliver it to all your friends. We have paid a heavy price for having you supporters of MEK in our prisons for the last 7 years. There is a lot of pressure on us by propagating that we are violating human rights. we do not have the power to respond to this amount of pressure, both abroad and domestic. At that time, the families had gone to Ayatollah Montazeri, who sent Mr. Nasserian, his representative, to control the prisons. The regime was under pressure. He said, "We executed all the prisoners to get rid of this pressure. Now we will release you all, but tell this to your friends, that we do not want prisoners anymore, and we do not want them to come back in the prison again. If we arrest you, we will execute them right away, and if somebody asks about them, we will say that they are marching in Ashraf." There was another point that I forgot to mention. In 1987, they held an exhibition in Evin prison. Mr. Nasserian, Ayatollah's Montazeri representative, told us, "Be aware, they have gathered all tools you have made in prison to skin fruits, and have brought the families of the victims of the war and are telling them the MEK supporters want to organize an armed operation in prison. And those are the tools which have been captured from them." According to Mr. Montazeri's representative, the regime was paving the way for the massacre. When they brought someone out the dead room and sentenced him to death, they definitely did not let him go back to others and tell them about it. Many prisoners who were then put in solitary confinements had writing on the walls of the cells, quote, "I went to the court today at this time and was sentenced to death, and I will be executed tonight or in few hours." These writings had been seen both in men's and women's cells. One of the prisoners whom I saw in Ward 209 was Ali Sawar, who was one of the prisoners of upper wards. He had been able to make contact to other prisoners in Ward 209 because of the guards' inattention. They had seen that he had written his name with a green marker on his left hand. He explained to them, "I went to the court today, and because of supporting the MEK, I was sentenced to death. And then they brought me here and gave me 2 bags. They told me to put my valuable belongings, such as my watch, in one of them, and gave me a piece of paper and told me to write my testament and put it in the other one. They also gave me a marker to write my name on my hand." In fact, Ali was going to be taken to the down floor of Ward 209, where the execution were taking place. I remember well that they tortured us in the same place in 1981, but in 1988, it was being used for the executions. At the time, some ordinary prisoner and Afghan prisoners whom we saw there told us that every night some prisoners were being executed there, and the next morning they took some sacks full of sandals which belongs to the executed prisoners. There was a prisoner who had 4 children, including 3 daughters. Nayeri had told the guard to take him to the basement and show him. The guard had taken him to the basement of Ward 209, and he had seen 5 prisoners, including 3 women and 2 men, who had been newly executed and were still hanging there. Then they had returned him to the court, and Nayeri had asked him, "What now? Have you changed your mind?" Nayeri was the judge. What we saw and heard indicates that Khomeini executed those prisoners in most savage way.
با تشکر از این وقتی که در اختیار ما قرار دادید و در این کنفرانس شرکت کردید. خیلی ممنون.
The massacre of 1988, which was the massacre of activists or sympathizers of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, was definitely a crime against humanity. It is a crime against humanity because it is an attack directed against a civilian population, and therefore it perfectly meets the definition of a crime against humanity. Since it was committed for political reasons, in particular, but also it's even more notable, it was for religious reasons. The members of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran were considered apostates, and so that makes it a religious issue. Therefore, the criteria of crimes against humanity can be doubled by another criteria, and it was not me who said it in the first place. It was a British lawyer who was with me at a meeting in Geneva 2 years ago. This can also be qualified as a crime of genocide, since these people were, in fact, massacred because of an alleged apostasy, therefore for religious reasons. The massacre of people for religious reasons perfectly meets the definition of genocide, as you can find in the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide. This is the reason why it's not at all an exaggeration to say that it's not only a crime against humanity because it was committed as part of a widespread attack on civilian population, which is the contextual criterion for political and religious reasons, but also, since there is the criterion of crime for religious reasons, you have there a crime which corresponds to the definition of genocide. Thank you.
And now we go to Germany, where we're joined by Farzaneh Sepehri, who has left Iran in recent years.
Hello to you, the dear viewers. I'm very delighted to have participated in this conference. My name is Farzaneh Sepehri. I am the daughter of Mother Sepehri. My family, since 1980, was a family that supported the Mujahideen. In 1981, my brother Mohammad Sepehri, who was 19 years of age and he was a student, was sentenced to death. Also, my cousin Fatemeh Shayeste, who was an army officer with the age of 26 or 27 years of age, she was also sentenced to death, and they were both executed in 1981. In 1982, my aunt, who was the mother of of Fatemeh Shayeste, my aunt's name was Soghra Davoudi, a supporter of Mujahideen, about 60 years of age. She was hanged, and also her son, Ahmad Reza, who was a law student, was also hanged in 1982. As we heard about that, about the vicious tortures, we learned that when the executioners were torturing Ahmad Reza, they put a funnel into his mouth and poured water mixed with chemical liquids and detergent powders and forced him to swallow. At that time, the executioners forced my aunt, the mother of this person, to watch and be witness to his son being tortured. When they were hanged, they first hanged my cousin to force the mother to see this scene or perhaps break her. So it was after him that they hanged my aunt. In 1986, Mohammad Reza Shayeste, my other cousin, who was an engineer, in 1986 in Tehran, Evin prison, was imprisoned and he was executed. Our family members would continuously be arrested, tortured, and executed until 1988 when the circumstances was changing. Tehran was in turmoil. My mother planned to leave the country. They wanted to leave the country along with his son, my younger brother, Mohammad Hanif Sepehri. My brother was only 5 years old at that time. They left house. They wanted to leave the country, but ever since we have had no traces of them. We still don't know their whereabouts. Since then till now, it's about 32 years. We have not seen my mom, nor have we seen my brother, 5 years old brother. They never gave us any information about them. We assumed that they have been arrested or even maybe martyred. But the question remains, unfortunately. My mother might have been executed on the charges of being a supporter. But what about my younger brother? How could they kill an innocent 5-year-old kid or make orphan of him? They didn't inform the family of his whereabouts. And after 32 years, we're still looking for any traces of my mom or my brother. Unfortunately, neither in Europe nor in Iran were we able to find any traces of them. I hope we'll see someday that the Iranian people's plight would be heard. Maybe someday the United Nations will understand what's happening to the Iranian people. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share the story of my family with you and perhaps raise my voice so that people would hear. I also call upon the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and European countries in Canada to establish independent fact-finding committees to find out about 1988 massacre, to put an end to the continuous crime against humanity. I hope they support and they help the Iranian people. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
فضل جان خیلی ممنون. فقط اگه بتونین یه توضیح هم در رابطه با اون قاب عکسی که کنارتون هست و اون شهدا هم برامون بدین.
This is my brother. He was 19. Mohammad Sepehri. He was executed in Mashhad. This is my mom. She was 46 or 47 years of age when she left home, and we never were able to find her at any time after that. This is my older cousin, Mohammad Reza Shayeste. He was an engineer. He was executed in Tehran. This is my other cousin, Fatemeh Shayeste. She was an army officer. She was executed without any kind of judicial process, not even a court-martial. She was executed in 1981. This is Ahmad Reza Shayeste. He was a law student. In the early month after the revolution, he was a student in the US, but he came back to Iran. He was unfortunately arrested by the regime and sentenced to death by hanging. This is my aunt, Sughra Davoudi, who was a 60-year-old housewife. She was a very kind person. She was active on charity works, not just after the revolution when she got to know the Mujahideen, but even before the revolution. She was always active in helping the poor and providing food for them. This picture belongs to my sister when she was a child. I don't have a picture of her older days. Fatemeh Sediqi, who was martyred in the Operation Eternal Light. My mom, I already told you. This is a picture of Behesht Reza grave, right? This is my brother's grave. They did not allow us to put a gravestone on that. So you see, it's just dirt. Every now and then we had to bring some dirt so the grave would not be flattened. But unfortunately, they have flattened the whole graveyard that belonged to the Mujahideen supporters. They have ruined this place. This picture belongs to the time when we were there, and we would go there regularly to pay tribute to the martyrs of Mujahideen. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of my younger brother here, who was 5. I hope he is still alive and well, wherever he is.
It's absolutely shocking that there are children who went to prison with their parents. Their parents were executed in prison, and no one knows what the fate of those children are. Now I'd like to invite Bob Blackman, member of the British House of Commons.
Colleagues and friends, it is again a great honour to be with you today, and thank you for the opportunity to join you at this important conference on the 1988 massacre in Iran. I want to begin by commending the Iranian resistance movement and its president-elect, Maryam Rajavi, for spearheading the global campaign to secure justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre in Iran and their families who've been waiting for over 3 decades to see those responsible being prosecuted for their undoubted crimes. I also want to address directly the victims of the regime in Iran, both inside Iran and abroad, who are listening and taking part in this conference today, and assure them that their voices are being heard here in the UK and in the UK Parliament. We will continue to raise this issue with our government until justice is served and seen to be done. With regards to the 1988 massacre in Iran, the international community and the United Nations have truly failed the Iranian people and their moral obligations as the vanguards and advocates of human rights. In this regard, we've already seen some movement from our allies in the United States. On the 17th of July, the spokeswoman on behalf of the United States Department of State highlighted the 1988 massacre of political prisoners by mentioning the role of death commissions in carrying out these mass executions, and said, instead of upholding justice, the Iranian judiciary oppresses and violates human rights. We urge the international community and individual governments to provide accountability and pursue justice for the regime's many victims. My colleagues and I in the United Kingdom House of Commons addressed exactly this issue in a parliamentary motion in 2016. 80 cross-party members of parliament supported the motion that I co-sponsored. That motion said that this House urges the United Kingdom government to recognise and condemn this brutal massacre as a crime against humanity, and ask the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, Human Rights Council, the General Assembly and the Security Council to order an investigation and bring the perpetrators to justice. Now, with this parliamentary support, the United Kingdom government has the right incentives to take actions on the 1988 massacre in Iran at the United Nations by introducing the demand for an international independent investigation into the 1988 massacre and the prosecution of the perpetrators into the United Nations resolution on Iran, which is currently being drafted right now and is expected to be adopted by the United Nations General Assembly later this year. Now, this is a chance for the United Kingdom to boost its credentials at the United Nations after our exit from the European Union and reaffirm its position as a force for good on the international scene. I urge the United Kingdom government to take this opportunity and show true British leadership at the United Nations. I will continue to stand with you and support the NCRI, who works on your behalf until we have secured justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre and brought those responsible for this crime against humanity to account. I end with a plea to the United Kingdom government to prescribe the IRGC in its entirety and to sequestrate their assets so they can no longer pursue their claimed gain to literally divide the Iranian community and carry on their propaganda, carry on their terrorism against those who are innocent victims and just want to live in peace and harmony and restore democracy to Iran, and to ensure that the Iranian people can feel represented by a government of their own choosing. So I stand with you and with all members of the NCRI in supporting Mariam Rajavi and her supporters to bring this to an end.
Thank you, Mr. Blackman. I think you touched on a very important issue. You pointed out to the statement made by Morgan Ortagus, the U.S. State Department spokesperson, on the anniversary of the start of the massacres, with the formation of the death committee. She stated that 2 of those who served in the death committees now hold some of the highest positions in the Iranian regime. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, my dear sister, Jamile Gholami. Her brother is one of the victims of the 1988 massacre.
I am Jamile Gholami, sister of Ali Asghar Gholami, who was arrested in March of 1981. In 1988, despite his sentence of life imprisonment, he was executed because of his resistance and steadfastness. His acquaintance with the Mujahideen goes back to early 1980. One day in Mashhad, my mom saw my brother. This is his picture. My brother was in a crowded center in Mashhad and was distributing books and newspapers of the Mujahideen with his friends. a group of Pastaran and Basij hoodlums in cars, motorcycles, and on foot attacked them, severely beat them, and broke everything they had. My brother was arrested in 1981 with no charge, no evidence, nothing. But they arrested him because of his resistance. The time that he served in the prison, he spent most of his prison time in solitary confinement under severe torture. When we went to visit him, Pastaran were present at all times. They told us once, we don't have anything to convict him. If he repents, he will be freed soon. My brother was outraged and shouted, I will never put my honor on sale. Out of question, do not ever talk of repentance at my presence. In June of 1988, my mother went to visit him. He wasn't there. After searching for 2 or 3 weeks, we found out that he was taken from Vakilabad to Kuhsangi for more torture. Before August, my brother and 4 others who had announced their position in support of Mujahideen were so brutally tortured that, according to their cellmates, he could not sit or lay down. Later, they executed him. In August, they executed 40 to 50 of those who were so-called on position. Not one of those who announced their position was freed or even left alive. None of them were freed. No one was left alive. They were buried in mass graves in Vakilabad. Even now, when my family goes to visit the grave, it's not known where he is buried. There's a mass grave that everyone goes to visit. During his last visit with my mother, he gave a piece of handcraft to my mother and said, deliver it to Jamile. I was in Iraq at that time. The gift was actually a letter addressed to Mr. Masoud Rajavi. The letter read as this: from the bottom of my heart, I salute your resilience and steadfastness. You are the emancipated. I salute you and shake your strong hands. I salute you, your firm steps, which I follow. I salute your eyes, which pierces one's soul. I salute your warm heart, which is full of love. I salute you, the migrated Mujahid. Here they don't just deprive us from bread and food. They want to deprive us from thoughts and opinions. Any reminder of you would be enchained. Let their ignorance be forever. They don't realize that your memories are encrypted in our hearts. So even if they tear out our hearts, they will only make your memories immortal. He had hidden this letter in the handcraft piece and sent it to me. I remember after a long time that I had not seen him. In 1982, they allowed us a visit. At that time I was in prison myself. After about 3 months, they allowed me to visit him. I was taken to him. I could not recognize him. He had grown a long beard. He was pale, skinny, and totally unrecognizable. He didn't speak. I mean, he did speak, but wouldn't tell what had happened to him. Where we met was a place in which I was formerly imprisoned. Therefore, I was familiar with it completely. There was a very big corridor. He said that they were being held there. They had turned the corridor into a set of many small cabinets or cupboards of dimensions like 1 meter in 1 meter in 40 centimeters. There was only one lamp over the whole corridor. On top of each cupboard, there was a circle-shaped hole of this size, the size of palm of a hand, for light and air. He had been kept there for 3 months. I don't know when they finally took him out. They gave him nothing, even basic personal necessities. Later, when I was released, whenever I went to visit him, it was always him who boosted my morale. He was such a source of cheerfulness, energy, belief, and perseverance. Later, when I was released, whenever I went to visit him, despite the fact that he was in prison and I was free, it was always him who boosted my morale. He was such a source of cheerfulness, energy, belief, and perseverance. The pastors were afraid of him. It was thanks to him that I was able to go to Iraq and join the organization in 1986. I will always be indebted to him. I thank God for being able to realize one of his wishes, which makes me proud as well. I will always be indebted and grateful to him.
جمیل جان خیلی ممنونیم از شما.
I think it's worth noting that the Behesht Reza cemetery in Mashhad has been leveled by the Iranian regime, an effort to be able to destroy all evidence of the 1988 massacre and the mass grave in this cemetery.
As the anthropologist Clyde Snow said at the trial of the Argentinian junta in 1985, bones make great witnesses. They speak softly, but they never forget and they never lie. That is why the Iranian regime is destroying these mass graves.
And now we have with us another eyewitness of the 1988 massacre, Bijan Zolfaqari, who spent 12 years in the notorious prisons of the Iranian regime.
I am one of the survivors of the 1988 massacre. I have spent time in Gohardasht, Rasht, and Evin prisons from 1981 to 1993. During the massacre, I was imprisoned in Gohardasht prison. Only a handful of prisoners survived that time. Most of the truth of that crime is still hidden behind the curtain, especially in provinces. For instance, the massacre in Rasht, that we have very little information. This matter reminds us of the beginning days of the executions in Gohardasht. During that time, I was in a section which looked down on the building and the airing yard, as they would call it, where the first executions of Gohardasht were taking place. Right before that, they removed the TV, then they cut off all the outdoor airings and the visitors, and they actually cut off from the world outside. One day, a guard entered the yard holding a wireless device and checked everywhere. It was the first case that aroused our suspicion. After a while, they brought in some prisoners whom my mates knew. Then they were moved through the main gates. Many of the pastaran, clerks, cooks, and service workers all were gathered, standing right behind the hand barrow filled with ropes, and they all went towards that building. They should all contribute to the crime, and so they would not reveal the secrets. That's why after 32 years, they still remain silent, because they're all participants in this crime. The crime is so heinous that no one opens mouth on that. I remember for some time, since my brother-in-law, Younes Qudrati, one of the martyrs of the massacre, was executed in Evin, they took my family to Vavak, the Ministry of Information. This is the picture of my brother-in-law. I should mention that Younes, in his last letter to his mother after his return to Evin prison, had written that the prison doesn't look the same as before. Everything has changed. The family would ask, what has changed? What do they want to imply? Later we understood that he meant the division of prisoners and preparations before the massacre. Always when I review the past, I remind myself and my friends of those conditions. Sometimes I ask myself, what could happen if that massacre didn't occur? What could transform the society in Iran? More than 30,000 people, patriot fighters. The regime knew exactly what was going on and what it was doing, what potential it was cutting away from the society. Another point I'd like to make is that at the time of the massacre, they were very much in a hurry to commit a crime. The regime faced the problem of political prisoners since 1981. The decision of mass killings in prison was a decision that was taken from a long time ago. They only looked for a chance to make it happen. After the ceasefire in the war, they took advantage of that opportunity and began the massacre. I was taken to the court twice. The first time, it was early days, as far as I remember. It was from our own section. Most of them were senior inmates of Gohardasht and Karaj. But the second time, around 2 weeks later, when I looked beneath my blindfolds, there was turmoil. Prisoners had been sitting everywhere. The corridors, the stairs, the cells, everywhere was filled up. They were all waiting. They were prisoners with sentences. And this is how unfair it was. The regime committed this knowingly and with precise plan. By eliminating the prisoners, the regime wanted to erase the question. They must pay for it. Every day we must protest so the international organizations would pursue this crime against humanity so it wouldn't repeat itself again. Thank you very much for listening to my words.
با تشکر از شما آقای ذوالفقاری، خیلی خوشحالیم که تو این کنفرانس شرکت داشتید. Imagine loads of rope, of nooses being taken, and you're seeing it, to go set up execution.
The same rope that you found in the bag of Mehran Biga, which we heard earlier today.
Now I would like to invite Alfred de Zayas, the former UN Special Rapporteur and independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order.
My name is Alfred de Zayas, and I was for the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. I served the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Human Rights Council from 2012 to 2018. And I had, in my official capacity as rapporteur, the opportunity of meeting many representatives of the Comité Ashraf, and I had the opportunity of speaking in numerous side events held at the Human Rights Council and speaking before the victims, before the Ashrafis in Ashraf 3. I attended a conference last summer, that was in July last summer, in Tirana, and had the pleasure of personally interviewing the victims. So I am particularly touched by the suffering of so many tens of thousands of Iranians whose revolution against the Shah was stolen, and who have suffered a theocratic government ever since, first under Khomeini and now, of course, under Khamenei, etc. Now, when I was in Camp Ashraf 3 in Tirana, I visited this absolutely most disturbing, sad, tragic compilation. This museum, this is a documentation of the 120 years of struggle for freedom of the Iranian people. This exhibition guide with the names of the 30,000 murdered in the summer of 1988. Here I have this book also, which I received from the Ashrafis. These are important documentations. This book, The Inquiry into the 1988 Mass Executions in Iran by my friend Tahar Boumedra. I mean, this is an incredibly important documentation. You even have here in this book, in facsimile form, the fatwa. So proof, incontrovertible proof of the deliberateness of the extermination of the Mujahideen opposition to the government. My colleagues, rapporteurs, also the rapporteurs on Iran, have been calling for a commission of inquiry, an independent commission of inquiry. That has been in my own recommendations, that has been in the recommendations of several United Nations rapporteurs, and most recently, last summer, in August of 2019, we had for the 42nd session of the Human Rights Council, we had this document. This is document AHRC 42 NGO 128, which describes the human rights situation in Iran and states quite correctly the United Nations must act against the perpetrators of the 1988 massacre in the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's reference here to the documentation of Amnesty International. There is reference to the problem of the destruction of the evidence. There's here the UN Special Rapporteur's position on the 1988 massacre, in particular, because there were several rapporteurs who pronounced themselves on the issue. My good friend Asma Jahangir, who unfortunately died untimely without finishing her mandate as a rapporteur on Iran. Obviously, there is documentation on all of these crimes, but there is not yet, as of this moment, an international commission of jurists in charge of this investigation, and that should end. Allow me to mention another problem that concerns you as it concerns me as a human being, COVID-19. I don't think that the regime in Iran has acted properly to defend the right to health of the Iranian people. Having said that, I think that it is important for the United Nations to call for the liberation of all political prisoners, in particular political prisoners who are at a higher risk because they are imprisoned. And the United Nations should also offer, obviously, all possibility of advisory services and technical assistance in order to help alleviate the suffering of the Iranian people in the context of COVID-19. There's a matter of international solidarity to help the people of Iran who are particularly touched, particularly made to suffer under this scourge of COVID-19. As has been said before by others, including myself, it's important to end impunity. We have, for this reason, established the International Criminal Court in The Hague. We want to ensure that in Iran and in other countries, there be no more impunity for all sorts of criminality, gross violations of human rights. Another concern of mine is that the number of political prisoners, the detainees, sometimes you call them political prisoners, sometimes you call them detainees, in Iran has increased. And also Iran has a very, very high incidence of the imposition of the death penalty. Personally, I am against capital punishment, and I do not believe that capital punishment is a form of deterrence of crime. It is more terrorism. I find that capital punishment, as it is implemented in many countries, does not protect the population from the criminality, but actually adds to the criminality. So all of these things, here again, my call to the United Nations, my call to my colleagues, rapporteurs and independent experts of the organization to insist on the liberation of political prisoners in Iran, and to insist on prompt action to protect the right to health of the Iranian people. With this, I wish you God bless. I wish you the protection of the Almighty, and I remain in solidarity with you. I will speak at the council whenever you wish to give me the honor to speak again on this subject, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zayas. I think you touched up on a very important issue with the spread of COVID-19 in the prisons of Iran and the plight of political prisoners, maybe something that we haven't had the chance to address extensively today. But as you mentioned, many of them are in very critical situation right now.
As our conference comes to a close, we'd like to thank the panel of experts, the eyewitnesses, and the relatives of those executed for being with us today and sharing their insight and painful memories. Thank you all.
And I'd like to thank all our viewers, those of you who've tuned in from around the world to show your solidarity. The reality is that the world has yet to learn about the atrocities committed by this regime, the ongoing atrocities being committed by this regime. And our responsibility today is, one, to echo the message of today's program. We'd like to ask all of you today to join us in the call for justice, echo the message of today's program, and to share this message with the international community and member states of the United Nations. Our message to the international community today is to end impunity on this ongoing crime against humanity. To do so, we ask all of you, one, to share this program on social media. Share today's program on social media with your foreign minister, your UN representative in New York, and also with your local media and international human rights organizations. Follow our campaign seeking justice using the hashtag 1988 Massacre and no impunity for mullahs. Thank you very much, and we hope to have you with us again very soon.